The origins, Zhang Qian's journey and the birth of the Silk Road. In the heart of ancient China, during the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, the winds of curiosity and ambition stirred within the imperial court. The year was roughly 138 BCE, and China was a vast yet inward-looking empire, hemmed in by mountains, deserts, and distant enemies. But beyond its borders lay whispers, rumors of powerful tribes, unfamiliar civilizations, and trade opportunities that extended far past the lands the Han knew. These rumors would become the seed of one of the most ambitious missions ever undertaken in Chinese history, one that would alter the world forever. The emperor, ever intent on expanding influence and securing alliances against the formidable Xiongnu Confederation to the north, chose a man of resilience, intelligence, and courage to embark on a journey that had never before been attempted by any emissary from the Middle Kingdom. That man was Zhang Qian. Zhang Qian was not a warrior in the traditional sense, nor was he a merchant. He was an envoy, a man whose loyalty to the emperor and patience in the face of hardship would become legendary. With a small escort and the imperial seal in hand, Zhang Qian set out westward into the unknown with a clear objective: to locate and establish contact with the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had once been driven westward by the Xiongnu. The Han hoped to form an alliance with the Yuezhi to encircle and weaken their common enemy. But the path to diplomacy would not unfold easily. Early in his journey, Zhang Qian and his party were captured by the Xiongnu, held captive for nearly a decade. Many would have succumbed to despair, forgotten their mission, or accepted a life in exile. But not Zhang Qian. Through those long years in captivity, he never lost sight of his original purpose. Eventually, he managed to escape with his faithful guide, continuing westward with a resolve few could match. He pressed through unforgiving terrain, across deserts and mountains, enduring both the extremes of nature and the complexities of foreign tongues and customs. When Zhang Qian finally reached the Yuezhi in the region of modern-day Bactria, he found a people who had settled into prosperous lands and were no longer interested in conflict with the Xiongnu. Though his original mission of military alliance failed, the significance of his journey was far from diminished. What he had seen, what he had recorded, and what he would eventually bring back to China would shape the destiny of entire continents. Zhang Qian's return to the Han court was not immediate. His travels stretched across years, covering thousands of miles and exposing him to an interconnected world the Han had never imagined. He passed through the lands of the Sogdians, encountered Parthian merchants, and witnessed a cultural vibrancy that revealed a hidden truth. China was not alone. Great cities bustled with life beyond the western frontiers. Empires rose and fell across Central Asia, and trade routes thrived even without China's participation. Goods, stories, and beliefs flowed like invisible rivers across the mountains and plains. From textiles to spices, from horses to metals, from musical instruments to philosophies, there existed a web of exchange waiting only to be linked. When Zhang Qian finally returned to China, weathered and aged but unbroken, he carried with him more than just the observations of a traveler. He brought maps, languages, intelligence, and perhaps most importantly, horses. The horses of the Fergana Valley, famed for their size, endurance, and strength, captivated the emperor. These heavenly horses were considered far superior to those bred within China and became a symbol of status and military might. The desire to obtain more of them would fuel further diplomatic and military expeditions, extending China's reach even deeper into Central Asia. Zhang Qian's reports detailed lands never before described in Chinese annals: the Dayuan, the Daxia, the Kangju, the Angxi. Each name represented a node in a greater network of civilizations, all interconnected through trade and movement. His tales ignited the emperor's imagination and shifted the Han dynasty's worldview. What began as a quest for alliance had transformed into a realization that China could become the center of a vast international trade system. This was not merely about goods. It was about influence, prestige, and contact with the broader human story unfolding far beyond the Great Wall. In response, the Han court began to systematically develop and protect trade routes leading westward. These trails, initially forged through diplomatic missions and military outposts, became lifelines of commerce. Silk, the prized textile that China alone knew how to produce, became the backbone of this growing trade network. Caravans laden with silk made their way westward, while exotic items flowed eastward in return: glassware, woolen goods, grapevines, and art. Alongside these material exchanges came intangible gifts: music, religious ideas, languages, and innovations. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a tapestry of routes, interwoven through mountains, oases, and empires. Yet it all traces back to Zhang Qian. Without his journey, the Chinese perception of the world beyond their borders may have remained cloistered for generations. His efforts paved the way for formal relations with foreign states, some of which China would later come to know as Persia, India, and Rome. In fact, Chinese records even describe distant envoys from a place they called Daqin, believed to be the Roman Empire, intrigued by the splendors of silk and eager to establish contact. The world, it seemed, was growing smaller, not in geography, but in connection. The Silk Road would eventually stretch over 7,000 kilometers, linking the Yellow River Valley to the Mediterranean Sea. It would carry with it the ambitions of emperors, the aspirations of merchants, and the faith of pilgrims. Great cities like Dunhuang, Samarkand, and Ctesiphon would rise along its path, thriving as melting pots of culture and commerce. But none of this would have begun without the seed of exploration planted by Zhang Qian and nurtured by the empire he served. His journey was not marked by conquest or colonization, but by curiosity and communication. He was not a general, yet his mission changed the strategic landscape. He was not a merchant, yet his journey unlocked unprecedented economic prosperity. He was not a theologian, yet the road he helped open would one day carry Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam across continents. Zhang Qian's life reminds us of the profound impact a single determined individual can have on the course of history. He ventured into the unknown not for glory, but for duty, returning with knowledge that reshaped an empire's identity and connected faraway peoples for centuries to come. While later travelers and conquerors would claim fame and fortune along the Silk Road, it was Zhang Qian who quietly lit the first torch, illuminating a path between worlds. As the Silk Road grew in complexity and scale, its spirit remained rooted in that first journey, an act of daring diplomacy, resilience in the face of hardship, and the timeless human yearning to reach across borders and know the other. The sands of Central Asia still remember the footprints of Zhang Qian. They mark not only a physical passage, but the moment when isolation gave way to exchange, when imagination gave way to reality. What began as a mission of war ended as a legacy of peace through connection. And so the Silk Road was born, not from conquest, but from vision. Not from greed, but from a desire to understand and relate. Zhang Qian did not set out to change the world, yet he did. His journey tells us that the most transformative revolutions often begin with a quiet step into the unknown. The road he walked has long since vanished under centuries of dust and stone, but its legacy endures in the artifacts of ancient cities, in the languages that blended across cultures, in the shared ideas that once rode on the back of caravans under the endless sky. Rome and the East, silk's mysterious arrival in the Mediterranean. Silk, the luminous, whisper-thin fabric that shimmered with color and mystery, arrived in the Roman world not with a grand proclamation, but through veils of secrecy, trade, and awe. By the time the Romans first encountered silk, likely sometime during the 1st century BCE, the fabric had already traversed immense distances, crossing deserts, mountains, and empires, silently carrying with it the weight of an entire civilization's ingenuity. The Romans were captivated. Nothing in their world matched the ethereal lightness or sensual texture of silk. It moved like liquid in the wind and shone with an unnatural luster. Yet despite their desire for it, they had no idea where it truly came from. To them, it was a gift from the mysterious East, an exotic marvel of unknown origins, sparking both obsession and confusion. The earliest mentions of silk in Roman records are not filled with certainty, but with fascination. Roman authors such as Pliny the Elder and Seneca the Younger referred to silk in tones of bewilderment, speculating about its creation. Some believed it grew on trees, harvested like cotton. Others thought it was combed from leaves or produced by unknown creatures in distant, unreachable lands. The real source, tiny worms spinning cocoons in the distant reaches of China, was a secret so carefully guarded by the Han Dynasty that not even Rome's powerful intelligence networks could pierce the veil. This concealment allowed the Chinese to dominate the silk market entirely, exporting the final product through a complex chain of intermediaries, while keeping the production method a state secret punishable by death. Silk entered the Mediterranean world primarily through overland trade routes that would later be known as the Silk Road. These routes were not single roads, but networks of caravan paths, mountain passes, and desert crossings, connecting the east to the west like arteries through which goods, ideas, and cultures pulsed. However, the silk did not travel as a direct handoff from Chinese to Roman merchants. Instead, it changed hands multiple times, from Chinese traders to Central Asian middlemen to Parthian or Sogdian caravanners to Nabatean or Syrian brokers, until it finally reached Roman markets, often in Antioch or Tyre. Each transfer added layers of mystique, inflated the price, and further obscured its origin. The final product was no longer just a commodity, it was a symbol, shrouded in enigma. The Parthian Empire played a crucial role in mediating this silk trade. Geographically positioned between Rome and China, the Parthians were both gatekeepers and manipulators of east-west commerce. They understood the value of the unknown and were careful to hide the true origin of silk from their Roman clients. They would often claim that silk came from the land of the Cirrus, a vague term referring to a distant people in the east, but little else was revealed. This strategic opacity gave them a monopoly over a product they did not produce. Rome, with all its power, could not breach this commercial curtain. Attempts to send direct envoys eastward met with limited success, if not outright failure. The Parthians ensured that silk remained a tightly controlled luxury, the source of which could not be traced or replicated by Roman hands. Despite the lack of clarity about its origins, silk became wildly popular among Rome's elite. It was worn by emperors, nobles, and courtesans, often as a visible declaration of status and sensuality. The transparency of silk garments, particularly when used in women's attire, caused scandal among conservative Roman senators, who decried it as morally corrupt and dangerously Eastern. Laws were even proposed to curb the wearing of silk, citing its decadence and the way it drained Roman gold into foreign hands. Yet such efforts were futile. Demand only grew. The mystery made it more desirable. The more Rome protested its seductive power, the more it wove itself into the heart of Roman culture. Beyond fashion, silk symbolized something larger. It embodied the allure of the unknown, the pull of the exotic, the promise of faraway wonders, the intangible dream of the East. It hinted at lands beyond maps, beyond military conquest, where Roman control ended and something different began. For an empire obsessed with order, control, and expansion, silk was a tantalizing reminder of what lay just out of reach. Even emperors, despite their disdain for foreign dependency, embraced it. Roman trade policies adapted, and Eastern luxury goods were increasingly accommodated in their economic framework. By the height of the empire, trade with the East had become not only economically significant, but culturally defining. To secure more direct access to silk and other Eastern luxuries, the Romans occasionally attempted to bypass Parthian intermediaries. The most notable effort came under Emperor Augustus, who sent diplomatic missions toward India and beyond, hoping to establish new trade links. While these missions did reach parts of the Indian subcontinent, they never penetrated far enough to reach Han China. The vastness of the terrain, political instability, and the resilience of intermediary states all acted as barriers. Even when Roman coins were found as far as southern China, there is no record of a direct Roman-Chinese dialogue in antiquity. The connection remained one of shadow and speculation. Meanwhile, in the East, the Chinese had their own perceptions of the West. To them, Rome, referred to in Chinese records as Da Qin, was a distant and powerful land, rich in gold and eager for their silk. Chinese envoys and scholars knew of a great empire beyond India, but the same barriers that prevented Rome from reaching China also hindered Chinese access to the Mediterranean. Thus, the two greatest empires of their time, while aware of each other's existence, remained strangers in practice. Silk served as their only real handshake across time and geography, a soft thread binding two worlds that could not meet. As centuries passed, the channels through which silk moved became increasingly sophisticated. Maritime routes began to supplement the overland paths. Ships traveled from Chinese ports to Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean and through the Red Sea, eventually reaching Roman Egypt. Alexandria, already a thriving center of commerce and culture, became a gateway for Eastern goods, including silk, entering the Roman world by sea. These maritime routes helped increase the availability of silk, but they did little to clarify its mystery. The secrecy of its production remained intact. Silk continued to be perceived as something magical, almost divine. The symbolic weight of silk grew alongside its economic value. It came to represent more than wealth. It symbolized contact with the unknown, interaction with powers beyond Rome's dominion. It was worn not only to flaunt status, but to participate in a kind of quiet cosmopolitanism. A Roman citizen donning silk was making a statement that they were part of a world bigger than Rome, tied into a web of civilizations, even if only by a thread. Over time, this delicate fabric became a vessel for imagination and ambition, a silent envoy from a world barely glimpsed but deeply felt. Even as the Roman Empire faced internal decline and external pressures in its later years, the allure of silk did not fade. It persisted in the courts of emperors and the wardrobes of aristocrats, even when the treasury could barely afford it. The longing for silk was not just about possession, it was about connection, about brushing against the edge of the unknown. It remained an echo of distant thunder, the whisper of a world just beyond the horizon. What makes the story of silk's arrival in Rome so compelling is not merely the fabric itself, but the drama of its journey, the political maneuvering, the cultural misunderstandings, the endurance of mystery across centuries. Silk became a kind of ancient riddle, its presence undeniable but its origins obscured. In an age where information traveled no faster than a horse or a ship, that mystery had power. It drew people in, made them dream, made them spend. The Romans, for all their might, could never quite grasp it. Silk remained elusive like a shimmer in the desert heat, seen, desired, but never fully understood. In the end, the arrival of silk in the Mediterranean was more than a moment in trade history. It was a moment in human longing, a desire to know the other, to reach across the vastness of the earth and touch something foreign, beautiful, and strange. Silk stitched together not only garments, but continents. It threaded east to west through a tapestry of trade, trust, and timeless fascination. And though empires rose and fell, the legacy of silk endured, soft, strong, and silent. The Sogdians, the invisible middlemen who kept the Silk Road alive. Long before the Silk Road became the well-known artery of trade connecting East and West, there was a people whose role was crucial, yet often invisible to the grand narratives of history. The Sogdians, hailing from the fertile valleys of Central Asia, were the indispensable middlemen who nurtured and maintained this vast network of commerce and cultural exchange for centuries. Their story is one of adaptation, diplomacy, linguistic mastery, and the subtle power of connection. Unlike conquerors who imposed their will by force, the Sogdians built their influence through commerce, trust, and a remarkable ability to navigate diverse political landscapes. Situated primarily in the region that corresponds to modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, the Sogdian homeland was a crossroads of cultures, languages, and ideas. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjakent thrived as bustling hubs where merchants, artisans, and scholars converged. Their origins trace back to the early Iranian peoples, yet their identity evolved through extensive interaction with neighboring civilizations, including the Chinese, Persians, Turks, and Byzantines. This cultural amalgamation not only enriched their own society, but equipped them with the tools necessary to operate as effective intermediaries in an era defined by shifting powers and fragile alliances. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a sprawling network of routes winding through deserts, mountains, and oases. While exotic goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals are often cited as the main commodities exchanged, the success of this trade depended largely on the knowledge, safety, and organization provided by the Sogdians. They were the expert guides, the multilingual negotiators, and the reliable agents who bridged the gap between distant markets and disparate peoples. What made the Sogdians so effective was their ability to adapt to varying political realities. Unlike empires that sought to dominate through conquest and control, the Sogdians operated within and alongside multiple powers, shifting allegiances when necessary to protect their commercial interests. Their merchant communities were established along the Silk Road's many stops, each serving as a safe haven for traders and a center for cultural exchange. The Sogdian merchants often acted as diplomats, translators, and financiers. Their proficiency in several languages and scripts, including Sogdian, Chinese, Middle Persian, and various Turkic tongues, allowed them to communicate across vast cultural divides. This linguistic skill was not merely a convenience but a strategic asset, enabling them to negotiate favorable terms and resolve disputes before they escalated. Moreover, the Sogdians introduced innovative business practices such as credit systems and merchant partnerships, which facilitated long-distance trade in an era when travel was perilous and unpredictable. Their networks were tightly knit yet flexible, capable of weathering political upheavals and regional conflicts that frequently disrupted other trade routes. Archaeological discoveries, including letters and contracts written in Sogdian, reveal the complexity and professionalism of their commercial dealings. These documents provide glimpses into a sophisticated mercantile society where trust, reputation, and legal frameworks govern transactions as much as tangible goods. Religious and cultural openness was another hallmark of Sogdian society, allowing them to thrive amid the Silk Road's diverse spiritual landscape. While many Sogdians practiced Zoroastrianism, their tolerance extended to Buddhism, Manichaeism, Christianity, and later Islam. This pluralism facilitated connections across communities and reinforced their role as cultural brokers. Temples, shrines, and places of worship in Sogdian cities often displayed a remarkable blend of iconographies, reflecting the syncretic nature of their identity. This openness was not only spiritual but also practical. By embracing and respecting the traditions of their trading partners, the Sogdians fostered goodwill and reduced the friction that could arise from cultural misunderstandings. Their art and architecture, characterized by vivid frescoes and intricate craftsmanship, bear witness to the rich tapestry of influences that passed through their cities. These artistic expressions served as both religious devotion and diplomatic currency, impressing travelers and dignitaries alike. The Sogdian traders' influence extended beyond mere commerce. They were pivotal in transmitting ideas, technologies, and artistic styles between East and West. From the spread of papermaking to the introduction of new musical instruments and religious concepts, the Sogdians acted as conduits of innovation and cultural diffusion. Their caravans carried not only goods, but stories, philosophies, and traditions that shaped civilizations far beyond their homeland. Despite their vital role, the Sogdians themselves often remain overshadowed in historical records, partially because their success lay in invisibility. They rarely sought to impose their culture aggressively or build empires. Instead, they preferred to operate quietly behind the scenes, weaving connections and ensuring the smooth passage of goods and information. Their power was subtle, embedded in the trust of merchants, the loyalty of communities, and the respect of rulers who recognized the economic benefits they brought. Over time, the rise and fall of empires, whether the Tang Dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, or the nomadic Turkic confederations, altered the dynamics of the Silk Road. Yet through these changes, the Sogdians adapted and persisted, shifting their centers of influence and forging new alliances. Eventually, as new trade routes emerged and political transformations swept across Central Asia, the Sogdian presence faded from prominence. Their language and distinct cultural markers gradually declined, absorbed into the tides of history. However, their legacy endured in the countless ways they connected worlds, shaped economies, and fostered cultural exchange. To understand the Silk Road is to recognize the indispensable role played by these invisible middlemen, whose enterprise and diplomacy kept the lifeblood of transcontinental trade flowing for centuries. In essence, the Sogdians represent a model of how influence need not be founded on force, but on commerce, culture, and connection. They demonstrate the power of adaptability, trust, and cultural fluency in bridging vast distances and disparate peoples. Their story invites us to reconsider historical narratives centered solely on empires and armies, highlighting instead the networks and human relationships that underpin global interaction. The Silk Road was more than a route for goods. It was a stage for ideas and identities, a place where civilizations met and transformed. The Sogdians were the weavers of the stage, crafting the unseen threads that held it together. From the bustling bazaars of Samarkand to the remote desert caravanserais, Sogdian traders maintained a delicate balance of risk and reward. Their caravans traversed some of the harshest terrains on Earth, from scorching deserts to towering mountain passes, always mindful of bandits, shifting alliances, and unpredictable climates. Their success required not only business acumen, but resilience and foresight. The caravan routes themselves became arteries of communication and mutual reliance, where information about weather, political events, and market trends was as valuable as the silks and spices carried in camel caravans. Their legacy also lies in the cultural hybridity they embraced and propagated. As they moved goods along the Silk Road, the Sogdians absorbed artistic motifs from India, Persia, China, and Rome, blending these influences into unique expressions that in turn influenced neighboring cultures. For instance, their adoption and promotion of Buddhist art contributed significantly to the transmission of Buddhism from India into East Asia. Likewise, Sogdian religious texts and iconography reflect a complex intermingling of beliefs, mirroring the diverse spiritual landscape of Central Asia. This cultural fluidity enhanced their ability to operate across borders and engage with peoples of vastly different traditions. Furthermore, Sogdian merchants were renowned for their integrity and professionalism. Maintaining reputation was paramount in a world where legal protections were often absent, and trust had to be earned and preserved over long distances and years. This ethic fostered lasting relationships that transcended individual transactions and linked communities along the Silk Road. Their commitment to fair dealing and conflict resolution not only facilitated trade, but contributed to a relatively stable environment in which commerce could flourish. Through oral agreements, written contracts, and informal networks, they established a foundation for economic cooperation that prefigured modern commercial law. An often overlooked aspect of their influence is their role in communication and diplomacy. The Sogdians served as intermediaries between empires, conveying messages, negotiating treaties, and helping to diffuse tensions. Their deep understanding of regional politics, combined with their extensive networks, made them invaluable agents for rulers seeking to extend influence without direct military engagement. This diplomatic function further embedded them within the political fabric of the Silk Road, ensuring their survival and prosperity despite changing rulers and regimes. The material culture left behind by the Sogdians, artifacts, manuscripts, and ruins, continues to reveal new insights into their complex society. Excavations at sites like Afrasiab, the ancient Samarkand, have uncovered exquisite frescoes depicting scenes of daily life, religious rituals, and international trade. These images depict not only merchants and caravans, but also dancers, musicians, and nobles, highlighting a vibrant society engaged in multiple spheres of life. The richness of these findings challenges earlier simplistic portrayals of the Silk Road as merely a conduit for goods, instead presenting it as a dynamic arena of cultural vitality. In literature, too, Sogdian influence echoes through the records of travelers and historians from many lands. Chinese chroniclers noted the skill and resourcefulness of Sogdian traders, sometimes contrasting them with less reliable merchants from other regions. Persian sources acknowledged their role as crucial intermediaries who linked the Islamic world with distant China. Even in Byzantine accounts, their presence is felt through references to exotic goods and the merchants who brought them. These scattered testimonies collectively attest to the broad reach and enduring importance of the Sogdians. Ultimately, the story of the Sogdians is a testament to the human capacity for connection and exchange across vast distances and cultural divides. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of globalization, long before modern transportation and communication made the world smaller. They remind us that behind every great network of trade and ideas, there are people whose ingenuity and perseverance make possible what seems inevitable in hindsight. The Sogdians may not dominate history textbooks as conquerors or kings, but their contribution is no less vital for it. Today, as we reflect on the history of the Silk Road, we must recognize the invisible hands that held it together. The Sogdians, through their tireless efforts, created a bridge not only for goods, but for civilizations, enabling a flow of culture, knowledge, and spirituality that shaped the development of the Old World. Their story encourages a broader view of history, one that values the merchants, diplomats, and cultural mediators as much as the emperors and armies. It is through their lens that we can truly appreciate the complexity and interconnectedness of ancient Eurasia. Art on the Move: How the Silk Road Painted the Walls of Dunhuang. In the vast and arid expanse where the Gobi Desert kisses the edge of the Chinese heartland lies a treasure carved into cliffs, Dunhuang, a name that echoes with the quiet resonance of centuries past. Situated along the ancient Silk Road, this remote city blossomed not merely as a trading post, but as a sanctuary for ideas, beliefs, and art that flowed like caravans through the corridors of time. The Mogao Caves of Dunhuang, often called the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas, became the beating heart of spiritual and artistic life along this crucial artery of Eurasian exchange. They were not built in isolation, but rather shaped by the winds of cultural transmission that swept across empires and deserts, carrying with them not only goods and people, but also pigments, philosophies, and brushstrokes. The art that covers the walls of Dunhuang is a visual symphony composed over centuries, reflecting a complex interaction of Indian, Persian, Greco-Roman, Central Asian, and Chinese influences. Each painting, each mural, each delicate carving within these caves is a silent testimony to movement, not only of people and goods, but of aesthetic techniques and spiritual ideals. As Buddhist monks traveled from India into China, they carried more than scriptures. They brought new forms of representation, new symbolic motifs, and new ways of seeing the divine. These visual traditions, once foreign, were embraced, transformed, and harmonized into a new artistic language that took root in Dunhuang. The figures that once stood rigid in early Chinese depictions softened under the influence of Gandharan art. Drapery began to flow with a sense of volume and depth. Halos gleamed around bodhisattvas, and celestial beings floated through golden skies above swirling lotus ponds. The Silk Road did not carry culture in only one direction. While India and Central Asia exerted their influence on the early Buddhist iconography of the region, Chinese elements began to infuse the imported traditions with their own signature flair. Landscape painting, calligraphy, and symbolic color use evolved distinctly in Chinese hands and were painted into the fabric of the caves. A viewer standing inside a Mogao grotto is not looking at a snapshot of any one culture, but rather experiencing a vast, layered palimpsest, a conversation between civilizations conducted not with words, but through art. The walls pulse with scenes of paradise and hell, imperial donors kneeling in devotion, elaborate narrative scrolls recounting the Jataka tales, and intricate depictions of Silk Road cities, merchants, and processions, reminding us that these caves were not only sacred spaces, but historical records. The logistics of creating this art were as impressive as the content itself. Pigments used in the murals were sourced from across continents. Lapis lazuli, with its deep celestial blue, was brought from what is now Afghanistan. Vermilion came from mineral cinnabar. Malachite gave birth to green tones, while gold leaf illuminated halos and ornaments with divine brilliance. The walls themselves were plastered, prepared with great care, then layered with lines and filled with hues. Teams of artists, often monks, artisans, and lay people working in tandem, labored over months and even years, painting not simply for beauty, but as acts of devotion and enlightenment. Every detail was intentional, from the delicate tilt of a bodhisattva's hand to the procession of elephants and horses moving across the lower walls. What is remarkable about Dunhuang is that its evolution never stood still. As dynasties rose and fell, as political powers shifted and religious beliefs adapted, so too did the artistic output of the caves. During the Northern Wei period, the art leaned heavily on Indian prototypes, marked by serene expressions and linear elegance. By the Tang Dynasty, arguably the golden age of Dunhuang art, the murals became richer, more dynamic, and more expressive. Court fashions were reflected in the clothing of divine figures. Musical instruments depicted in the murals mirrored those played in Chang'an. The cosmopolitanism of the Tang court spilled into the caves, where Indian mandalas sat beside Chinese-style pavilions, and where Persian floral patterns curled beside Han motifs. The Mogao caves were not only religious shrines, but active centers of translation and scholarship. The presence of the library cave, sealed in the 11th century and rediscovered in the early 20th, attests to the scholarly life that once thrived here. This single cave, held tens of thousands of manuscripts in multiple languages: Chinese, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Tibetan, and more, reflecting the multilingual, multicultural milieu of Silk Road society. It is likely that the same intercultural dialogue visible in manuscripts found its way into the iconography and storytelling on the cave walls. Stories were not only read but visualized, shaped to suit the doctrinal needs and aesthetic tastes of changing audiences. Dunhuang's murals also captured the real, grounded aspects of life on the Silk Road. Beyond heavenly beings and mythological scenes, they offered depictions of caravans winding through mountain passes, of merchants unloading goods, of bridges, towers, and marketplaces bustling with activity. These are not abstract or symbolic images. They are vibrant documents of a world in motion. Through their details, we glimpse camels draped in silk and adorned with bells, couriers navigating the harsh terrain, and inns providing rest to weary travelers. The artists, perhaps knowingly or not, served as historians as much as they did as painters. Even artistic techniques traveled alongside content. The use of shading to depict volume, the application of aerial perspective to suggest depth, and the framing of narrative scenes in sequential panels reveal a high level of sophistication influenced by foreign models. These innovations were not copied blindly, but thoughtfully adapted to local sensibilities. The result is a body of art that, while unmistakably rooted in Buddhism, overflows with universal human emotion: compassion, fear, awe, and longing. Over the centuries, patronage played a crucial role in the creation and continuity of Dunhuang's artistic tradition. Emperors, officials, military governors, and wealthy families all sponsored caves, seeing in them not only spiritual merit, but a chance to project political prestige and cultural sophistication. The walls became canvases not just for divine figures, but for portraits of donors, often depicted with inscriptions naming their contributions. Through these additions, the caves became collaborative projects where faith, politics, and personal legacy intertwined. The physical space of the caves themselves enhanced the spiritual power of the art. Unlike scrolls or wall hangings, these murals were meant to envelop the viewer completely. Entering a grotto was akin to stepping into a divine realm, a sacred bubble sealed from the dust and toil outside. In the flickering light of oil lamps, the figures on the walls would seem almost alive, their painted eyes following the visitor, their gestures guiding prayers. Ceiling designs of celestial heavens with concentric circles, stars, and dancers gave the illusion of infinite space overhead. This immersive quality made Dunhuang's caves not just places to observe art, but to inhabit it, to meditate within it, and to seek transformation through it. Time, of course, has not spared these masterpieces. Wind, sand, war, and neglect took their toll. Yet paradoxically, the very remoteness that once made Dunhuang a crossroads also helped preserve it. Hidden for centuries, the caves survived when other works of ancient art vanished. Today, they stand not merely as relics, but as enduring witnesses to the potential of human creativity when it is nourished by cross-cultural contact. The Silk Road did not just move bolts of silk and bags of spice, it moved brushes, visions, pigments, and prayers. In Dunhuang, one sees what happens when art is allowed to travel, to transform, and to transcend. The walls speak a language older than words, yet more immediate than any speech. They remind us that art is never static. It breathes with every hand that adds to it, with every eye that beholds it, and with every soul that finds within it a flicker of understanding. In the flow of caravans and the hush of desert sands, art on the move found a resting place on the cliffs of Dunhuang, and in doing so became eternal. Silk and spice, what was actually traded on the Silk Road. Silk and spice may headline the stories, but the truth of what was traded along the Silk Road is vastly more complex, layered, and rich than those two luxurious items suggest. Stretching thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and empires, the Silk Road was less a single route and more a sprawling network of interconnected paths that carried not only goods, but ideas, cultures, and technologies between East and West for centuries. Traders, caravans, and adventurers traveled these routes in pursuit of profit, discovery, and sometimes even survival, transporting a staggering diversity of items that reshaped the civilizations they touched. At the heart of this web was silk, the gleaming thread that lent the route its name. Originally guarded as a closely held secret by the Chinese, silk was valued not only for its beauty and smooth texture, but also for what it represented: refinement, status, and mystery. In Roman times, the elite draped themselves in flowing garments of translucent silk, believing it to be a material of divine origin. But silk was never just about fashion. It was a form of currency, a gift of diplomacy, and a symbol of imperial prestige. The Chinese government often used silk to pay soldiers, secure alliances, and influence bordering nomadic tribes. The value attached to this lightweight material made it one of the most sought-after commodities in the ancient world, justifying dangerous journeys across treacherous landscapes. But the caravans did not travel with silk alone. Spices were equally treasured. From India, Ceylon, and the Spice Islands came pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, and nutmeg. These pungent powders and dried herbs were used to preserve food, add flavor, and prepare medicinal remedies. In societies without refrigeration or modern medicine, spices weren't just culinary luxuries. They were essential. The Roman appetite for pepper, for instance, was so insatiable that it is said Roman gold drained eastward by the ton in exchange for tiny black peppercorns. To many merchants, spices were more valuable than gold. They were light, portable, and fetched high prices. The promise of such profits drove merchants to cross arid deserts, brave mountain passes, and navigate the uncertain politics of distant courts. Still, the Silk Road hosted more than just the glamorous goods. Everyday items filled merchant bags and caravan carts. Wool from Central Asian sheep, furs from the cold forests of Siberia, and hides from the steppes were all traded extensively. These materials were prized in regions where animal husbandry was less common, or where the quality of local breeds could not match the offerings from afar. Likewise, cotton textiles from India, dyed in vibrant hues and patterned with detailed block prints, were carried westward. Indian weavers had mastered the art of cotton production, and their goods were widely admired for both softness and durability. Glassware moved eastward, particularly from the Roman Empire. Artisans in Syria and Egypt developed glass-blowing techniques that produced vessels of striking clarity and elegance, objects highly prized in China, where glassmaking had not yet reached the same sophistication. These fragile items, wrapped in layers of straw and wool, survived perilous journeys to become treasures in distant courts. Alongside glass came other works of craftsmanship. Carved ivory, ceramics, and bronzes from Persia and the Mediterranean made their way to distant lands, each item telling a story of its origin. Metals were another staple of Silk Road commerce. Gold and silver traveled in both directions, though often more in the form of coins than bullion. Chinese jade and nephrite also flowed westward. Regarded as more than just gemstones, they were considered spiritually powerful materials cut into ritualistic objects and personal ornaments. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, with its rich celestial blue, was sent eastward and used in paintings and jewelry in both India and China. Gems like rubies and sapphires passed through hands and across borders, ending up in royal treasuries, temples, and ceremonial regalia. Paper, one of the most transformative products of the Silk Road, quietly revolutionized the way people communicated and preserved knowledge. Originating in China, paper-making spread through the Islamic world and eventually into Europe. Its arrival in Samarkand, then Baghdad, then Cairo and Andalusia, allowed for an explosion of written culture. Science, poetry, philosophy, and administration all flourished with this new medium. Without the movement of paper and the knowledge of how to create it, the Renaissance might have taken a very different path. Precious knowledge also traveled, carried not in saddlebags but in mines and manuscripts. The Silk Road was as much about intellectual exchange as it was about commerce. Scientific concepts, mathematical ideas, artistic techniques, and medical practices migrated across cultures. Greek philosophy found a new home in Islamic centers of learning, while Chinese astronomy influenced Islamic star charts. Indian numerals carried westward would later become the foundation of modern Western mathematics. The transmission of such ideas often accompanied the movement of goods, as scholars, pilgrims, and diplomats walked the same dusty roads as merchants. Religious relics and texts also moved along the Silk Road. Buddhist sutras journeyed from India into China and beyond, carried by monks and missionaries. Along with them came statues, ritual items, and relics. Similarly, Islamic calligraphy, Quranic manuscripts, and decorative arts traveled eastward. Christian icons and relics found their way into Central Asia, often blending stylistically with local traditions. These objects carried not only spiritual significance but also political meaning, used by rulers to legitimize power and cultural identity. Animals, too, were part of the Silk Road's ecosystem of exchange. Horses from the Central Asian steppes were particularly valued in China, leading to the establishment of specialized trade routes sometimes referred to as the Heavenly Horse Road. Chinese envoys bartered silk for these powerful war horses, essential for defending their northern frontiers. Camels, especially the Bactrian variety with 2 humps, were traded and used as the main beasts of burden across desert terrain. These hardy creatures became synonymous with Silk Road travel, capable of surviving long stretches with little water and food. Less glamorous, but no less important, were the mundane items traded in bulk: salt, grains, dyes, and oils. Salt in particular had immense value, especially in regions where natural sources were scarce. Dyes made from plants like indigo and madder created brilliant blues and reds that were coveted by weavers and tailors across continents. These trades helped sustain local economies and supported the daily lives of ordinary people far removed from the elite courts and bustling markets. Aromatics like frankincense and myrrh, harvested from trees in Arabia and East Africa, were used in religious rituals, embalming, and medicine. Their resinous fragrance made them a luxury in both temples and homes. Meanwhile, perfumes and oils, some infused with saffron or rose, traveled in small sealed containers, becoming favorite imports in Roman and Persian courts. Their presence in these regions underscored the Silk Road's role in shaping the sensory experience of civilizations. Weaponry and military equipment also flowed along these routes. Steel from India, particularly the famed Wootz steel, was exported and later became the material of choice for forging Damascus blades. These weapons, renowned for their sharpness and patterned beauty, were prized by warriors and nobles across Eurasia. Armor, bows, and other military tools often accompanied these shipments, especially as empires sought to arm their soldiers with the finest materials available. Interestingly, disease was an unintentional passenger on the Silk Road. While not a traded good, it remains an inseparable part of the Silk Road story. The Black Death, which decimated populations across Eurasia in the 14th century, is believed to have traveled these trade routes from Central Asia to Europe. This tragic consequence highlights how deeply interconnected these regions had become, not only through commerce, but also through vulnerability. Despite the immense wealth that changed hands, not everything was measured in gold or silk. Trade was often conducted through barter, relationships, and trust built over years of mutual exchange. Caravanserais, rest stops along the road, became centers of cultural fusion where languages blended, cuisines mixed, and people of many faiths interacted. These hubs were essential in maintaining the flow of trade and the safety of those traveling such enormous distances. Ultimately, the Silk Road was not defined by a single commodity or culture, but by the diversity of what passed along it. From jade carvings to medical herbs, from songbirds in cages to ink and brushes for poetry, the route carried the physical and intellectual wealth of continents. It was not merely a conduit for silk and spice, but a living artery of civilization. The things traded along the Silk Road shaped fashion, diet, technology, religion, and thought in nearly every corner of the known world. Through these exchanges, the ancient world became smaller, more connected, and infinitely more complex. The Silk Road remains not just a relic of the past, but a profound symbol of humanity's enduring desire to connect, share, and grow. The Persian connection, Sassanid Persia's strategic role. The Sassanid Empire, often known as the last great Persian empire before the advent of Islam, was a formidable power that shaped much of the political and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East. Rising from the ashes of the Parthian Empire in the early 3rd century CE, the Sassanids established their dynasty through the efforts of Ardashir I, who claimed descent from the legendary Achaemenid kings and positioned his reign as a revival of Persian glory. Their rule lasted over 4 centuries and brought to the region a remarkable synthesis of cultural, religious, and military developments. The Sassanid Persians were not merely conquerors or rulers. They were strategic architects of a vast and complex geopolitical arena, with an influence that extended from the Arabian deserts to the eastern fringes of India and from the Caucasus Mountains down to the deserts of Arabia. At the heart of the Sassanid strategy was the recognition that controlling key trade routes and economic arteries was essential for maintaining power and projecting influence. The empire commanded critical segments of the Silk Road, the network of caravan routes linking China with the Mediterranean, which allowed the Persians to act as intermediaries between East and West. This control was not accidental, but the result of careful diplomatic and military efforts to secure important cities and caravanserais that facilitated the flow of goods such as silk, spices, precious metals, and luxury items. The Sassanids understood that economic strength was intertwined with military might and cultural prestige, and so they invested heavily in fortifying cities along these trade corridors. These efforts ensured a steady influx of wealth into the empire, which in turn financed their armies and cultural endeavors. One of the most critical aspects of the Sassanid Empire's strategic position was its role as the primary rival to the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire. The two powers shared a long and often hostile border stretching across the rugged terrain of Mesopotamia and Armenia. This frontier was a constant theater of war, diplomacy, and shifting alliances. The rivalry between the Sassanids and the Romans was not only a contest for territory, but also for ideological supremacy and control over buffer states. The Persians employed a mix of military innovation, political alliances, and religious symbolism to strengthen their claim to legitimacy in the region. Their frequent confrontations with Rome solidified their reputation as a resilient and powerful empire, capable of challenging one of the ancient world's mightiest civilizations. The Sassanids also implemented a sophisticated administrative system that bolstered their strategic capacity. They divided their empire into provinces governed by satraps and margraves who maintained order, collected taxes, and raised armies when needed. This decentralized approach allowed for flexibility in governance and rapid mobilization of forces in response to internal rebellions or external threats. The use of fortifications, including numerous frontier castles and walled cities, created a defensive network that safeguarded the empire's borders and trade routes. This infrastructure enabled the Sassanids to withstand invasions and exert control over diverse populations, from the Arab tribes in the south to the nomadic groups in the north and east. Religion played a critical role in the Sassanid strategic framework. The empire endorsed Zoroastrianism as the state religion, which was not only a spiritual system but also a unifying cultural and political force. The clergy, particularly the Magi, held significant influence in court and society, shaping policies and promoting social cohesion. Zoroastrianism's dualistic worldview of good versus evil paralleled the empire's ongoing struggle against its rivals, especially the Christian Byzantine Empire. This religious dimension added a layer of ideological conflict to the already intense geopolitical rivalry. Furthermore, the Sassanids were tolerant of other faiths within their realm, including Judaism, Christianity, and various local cults, which helped maintain internal stability among their multi-ethnic population. Culturally, the Sassanid Empire was a crucible of artistic and intellectual activity. The capital city of Ctesiphon, located near modern-day Baghdad, became a vibrant center where Persian, Hellenistic, Indian, and Mesopotamian traditions mingled. The architectural marvels of the empire, including grand palaces and fire temples, reflected both imperial power and religious devotion. The Sassanid court sponsored scholars, poets, and artisans, creating a cultural renaissance that would leave a lasting imprint on Islamic civilization. This flourishing of culture was part of the empire's broader strategy to legitimize its rule and project its prestige to neighboring states and peoples. In military terms, the Sassanid Empire was renowned for its cavalry, particularly the elite cataphracts, heavily armored horsemen who could break enemy lines with their shock tactics. The Sassanid armies also utilized war elephants, siege engines, and advanced fortification techniques, demonstrating a high degree of military sophistication. The empire's forces were well-trained and disciplined, enabling them to defend their territory effectively and to launch campaigns deep into enemy lands. The persistent conflicts with Rome and later Byzantium forced the Sassanids to continuously adapt their military strategies, making them one of the most formidable armies of the ancient world. The Sassanids' strategic vision extended beyond military and economic dominance. They sought to influence the political dynamics of neighboring regions. Their relations with the Arab tribes to the south were complex, involving a combination of alliances, vassalage, and occasional conflicts. The empire exerted influence over the Arabian Peninsula by supporting client states and controlling parts of the Persian Gulf coastline. This influence was crucial in securing the empire's southern flank and protecting the lucrative trade routes that passed through the region. The interactions between the Sassanids and Arab tribes also set the stage for the dramatic transformations that would follow with the rise of Islam. To the east, the Sassanids maintained tenuous control over regions that are now parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, competing with the Kushan and later Hephthalite powers. These eastern territories were vital for the continuation of Silk Road commerce and the spread of culture and ideas. The empire's ability to project power into these distant lands was limited but significant, demonstrating their ambition to be a pan-Eurasian power. Through diplomacy and military expeditions, the Sassanids attempted to assert dominance and maintain influence over these frontier zones, which served as conduits for goods and cultural exchange between the Indian subcontinent and the West. One of the defining features of Sassanid diplomacy was its ability to use marriage alliances, treaties, and religious patronage to build networks of influence. The royal family often intermarried with regional elites to secure loyalty and integrate diverse groups into the imperial structure. Treaties with neighboring powers, including the Romans and various nomadic tribes, were used strategically to buy time, secure borders, and foster economic cooperation. Religious patronage, especially of Zoroastrian institutions, reinforced the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty and promoted social stability. These diplomatic tools were essential components of the Sassanid strategic approach, allowing them to navigate the complex and volatile politics of late antiquity. The eventual decline of the Sassanid Empire was influenced by both internal and external pressures, but its strategic legacy endured. The protracted wars with Byzantium drained the empire's resources and weakened its military capacity. Internally, the empire faced revolts, court intrigues, and succession crises that undermined its cohesion. The rapid expansion of the Arab Muslim armies in the 7th century CE ultimately toppled the Sassanid state, ending centuries of Persian imperial dominance. However, the administrative structures, cultural achievements, and geopolitical frameworks established by the Sassanids profoundly influenced the succeeding Islamic empires, which inherited and adapted much of the Persian legacy. The Sassanid Empire's strategic role in history can also be understood through its impact on the transmission of knowledge and culture across continents. The empire served as a vital conduit for the exchange of scientific, philosophical, and religious ideas between East and West. Manuscripts and scholarly works preserved in Persian libraries and academies were later translated into Arabic and became foundational texts for the Islamic Golden Age. The Sassanids' patronage of scholars and their openness to diverse intellectual traditions facilitated the preservation and dissemination of knowledge that would shape medieval and early modern civilizations. Furthermore, the Sassanids contributed to shaping the political identities and territorial boundaries of the Middle East. Their efforts to consolidate Persian identity and authority laid the groundwork for the enduring concept of Persia as a distinct cultural and political entity. The memory of the Sassanid Empire persisted in later Persian literature and historiography, serving as a symbol of national pride and aspiration. The empire's struggle against Rome and Byzantium also became part of the collective memory and mythology of the region, influencing the narratives of subsequent empires and peoples. In terms of economic infrastructure, the Sassanid rulers implemented reforms that improved agricultural productivity, taxation systems, and trade regulation. They built canals, roads, and irrigation works that enhanced the empire's ability to sustain large populations and armies. Market towns and caravanserais proliferated, serving as hubs for merchants and travelers. These developments reflected a comprehensive understanding of how economic vitality underpinned political power and military success. The empire's wealth was not solely based on conquest, but on the efficient management of its resources and the facilitation of commerce. The Sassanid legal system also played a strategic role in maintaining imperial control. Laws derived from a mixture of Zoroastrian principles, royal decrees, and customary practices created a framework for governance that emphasized justice, social order, and respect for authority. Courts operated at various levels, from local magistrates to royal judges, ensuring that disputes were resolved within the imperial framework. The legal system helped integrate the empire's diverse populations and maintain the social hierarchy essential for political stability. The cultural and artistic achievements of the Sassanid period, including metalwork, textiles, and manuscript illumination, were not only expressions of aesthetic values but also served diplomatic and ideological functions. Luxurious goods produced under royal patronage were often used as diplomatic gifts to cement alliances or impress rivals. The imagery and symbolism embedded in Sassanid art reinforced the divine right of kings and the empire's cosmic mission. These cultural products thus became tools of soft power, extending the empire's influence beyond the battlefield. One of the enduring legacies of the Sassanid strategic role was the influence on military tactics and organization. The concept of a professional standing army, combined with the use of local levies and mercenaries, allowed for flexibility and rapid response to threats. Their innovations in cavalry tactics, siege warfare, and fortification design were studied and adapted by neighboring powers. The empire's emphasis on military readiness and logistics reflected a long-term strategic vision aimed at preserving sovereignty and deterring aggression. Despite the empire's eventual fall, the Sassanid contribution to shaping the religious and cultural environment of the Near East was profound. Their promotion of Zoroastrianism, even as other religions flourished under their rule, influenced the spiritual landscape for centuries. The empire's interactions with Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and emerging sects created a rich tapestry of religious coexistence and conflict that defined the region's character. The Sassanid experience highlighted the challenges of governing a multi-faith empire and the ways in which religion could be both a unifying and divisive force. In conclusion, the Sassanid Empire's strategic role was multifaceted and far-reaching. Through military prowess, economic control, cultural patronage, and diplomatic acumen, the Persians forged an empire that stood as a formidable counterpart to Rome and Byzantium. Their ability to manage diverse peoples and territories, secure vital trade routes, and foster a distinctive Persian identity ensured their place in history as key players in the ancient world's power dynamics. Though the empire eventually succumbed to new forces, its legacy continued to influence the course of Middle Eastern and world history, testifying to the enduring significance of the Persian connection. Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, the great unifier of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, though often remembered for its relentless conquests and fearsome warriors, played an unexpectedly transformative role in shaping the Silk Road into one of the most integrated and efficient trade networks the world had ever seen. In a time when fractured empires, political unrest, and banditry had rendered long-distance trade both perilous and unpredictable, the rise of Genghis Khan brought a kind of order that spanned continents. Through a combination of disciplined military campaigns, calculated diplomacy, and visionary governance, the Mongol Empire didn't merely conquer land. It connected civilizations that had long remained distant, distrustful, and divided. What began as a mission to unite the Mongol tribes under a single banner evolved into one of the largest contiguous empires in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the fringes of Europe. This vast expanse of territory under one political and military system became the backbone of what would be a golden age for the Silk Road. At the heart of Genghis Khan's achievement was his ability to establish a stable and highly organized administration. Far from being a mere warlord, he recognized that sustained power required more than battlefield victories. The empire he built was structured around loyalty, meritocracy, and communication. He instituted a system of law known as the Yasa, which emphasized discipline and justice, not only for the Mongols but also for the conquered peoples. By enforcing these laws consistently across such a vast region, the Mongols created an environment in which merchants, travelers, and diplomats could move with an unprecedented level of safety. The Silk Road, once dotted with checkpoints run by rival factions and plagued by extortion, suddenly became a superhighway of commerce, protected by Mongol patrols and overseen by a centralized authority that valued trade as much as territory. One of the most significant contributions of the Mongol Empire to the Silk Road was the implementation of a sophisticated relay system for messages and goods. Known as the Yam, this network of way stations and mounted couriers allowed for rapid communication across the empire. This system not only improved military coordination, but also revolutionized trade logistics. Merchants could now send messages ahead to coordinate shipments or learn about regional market conditions, reducing risks and enhancing efficiency. The stations themselves served as hubs where travelers could find food, shelter, and protection, crucial amenities for those traversing long and treacherous routes through deserts, mountains, and unfamiliar territories. The Mongol rulers, under Genghis Khan and his successors, also demonstrated a remarkable openness to different cultures, religions, and technologies. While they were fierce on the battlefield, they often spared the artisans, engineers, scholars, and religious leaders of conquered cities, recognizing their value in enriching the empire. This policy encouraged the movement of skilled individuals across Eurasia, leading to an exchange of ideas that paralleled the movement of goods. Persian astronomers, Chinese doctors, Indian mathematicians, and Arab geographers found themselves in dialogue with one another under the protective umbrella of Mongol rule. This intellectual exchange was as crucial to the Silk Road's vitality as the trade in silk, spices, and gems. Moreover, the Mongol Empire actively encouraged trade through reduced tariffs and the establishment of diplomatic relations with far-off kingdoms. Genghis Khan and his descendants saw merchants not merely as profiteers, but as essential to the lifeblood of the empire. To that end, they provided merchant caravans with official passports and military escorts when necessary. The flourishing trade attracted not only goods, but also people from distant lands. Italians, Syrians, Persians, Chinese, and Central Asians all found places of connection and opportunity within Mongol territory. This melting pot of languages, currencies, and customs generated new forms of cross-cultural collaboration that would leave an enduring mark on history. The cities that lined the Silk Road during Mongol rule began to blossom. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, once vulnerable outposts, transformed into cosmopolitan centers teeming with life. Markets overflowed with textiles, ceramics, books, perfumes, and even exotic animals. Caravanserais, inns built specifically for traders, sprang up along the route, offering a rare consistency of lodging and services. These were more than mere rest stops. They became social nodes where merchants could exchange not only merchandise, but also news, innovations, and strategies. The integration of East and West under Mongol governance allowed for a level of cultural transmission that had been previously impossible. Paper-making techniques from China, for instance, spread into the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, helping to fuel the coming age of literacy and enlightenment. In addition to material trade, spiritual and philosophical currents also flowed more freely. Buddhist monks, Christian missionaries, Islamic scholars, and Taoist sages all found space to travel and preach under Mongol rule. The empire did not impose a single belief system, but instead fostered an environment of religious tolerance, which allowed different faiths to coexist and sometimes blend. This diversity enriched not only the cultural life of cities, but also influenced the art, architecture, and literature that emerged during this period. Sacred texts were translated into new languages, and architectural styles merged to form distinctive regional hybrids that still stand today. Importantly, Genghis Khan's legacy continued through his descendants, particularly under the rule of Kublai Khan. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by the Mongols, maintained the Silk Road's infrastructure and actively participated in maritime trade as well. Kublai Khan invited foreign traders, including the Venetian Marco Polo, to his court, and encouraged economic activity that extended beyond the overland routes. The Mongol Empire's reach into both land and sea trade created a unique moment in history when much of the known world was connected not just through conquest, but through mutual curiosity and commercial ambition. Despite the eventual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, its impact on the Silk Road endured long after the last of the Khans had faded from power. The network of roads, the diplomatic ties, the administrative systems, and the sense of a connected world remained. Even as new empires rose and borders shifted, the memory of the Mongol-paved Silk Road lingered, serving as a model of what could be achieved when ambition was paired with vision and structure. The remnants of Mongol policies, be it in postal systems, trade protections, or multiculturalism, continued to shape the development of Eurasian societies for centuries. What makes the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan particularly remarkable is not just the scope of its territory or the swiftness of its rise, but its paradoxical ability to bring peace through power. The so-called Pax Mongolica, the peace that prevailed across vast regions of the empire, was more than just a lull in conflict. It was a rare moment in world history when trade, communication, and culture could thrive on a continental scale. Merchants could travel thousands of kilometers with far less fear of piracy, bribery, or war. Ideas that once would have remained trapped within regional boundaries now leaped across deserts and mountain ranges, reshaping societies far from their origin. Genghis Khan himself, though a figure surrounded by legends of blood and brutality, also deserves recognition as a strategic mind who understood the long-term value of unity and exchange. His reforms laid the groundwork for something far greater than empire. They allowed for a new kind of connectivity between civilizations. The scars of war and conquest are undeniable, but so too is the infrastructure of cooperation that was built in their wake. While no empire lasts forever, the model of integration and protection that the Mongols applied to the Silk Road proved that even the most turbulent of conquests could lead, paradoxically, to a golden age of peace, prosperity, and understanding. In the end, the Mongol Empire's greatest victory may not have been in the cities it conquered or the armies it defeated, but in the pathways it opened between worlds. Genghis Khan, the master of war, inadvertently became a master of connection, uniting not just tribes and territories, but entire cultures and continents under the shared promise of trade, trust, and transformation. Disease on the road, how the Silk Road spread the Black Death. The Silk Road, a sprawling network of trade routes that once connected the east to the west, is often romanticized as a channel for the exchange of luxurious goods, cultural ideas, and technological innovations. Yet, within the shadows of silk and spice lay an invisible terror: disease. Among the most devastating consequences of this transcontinental highway was the transmission of the Black Death, a plague that would come to redefine the trajectory of human civilization. This vast corridor, which linked distant empires and diverse peoples, also became an unintentional vector for one of history's deadliest pandemics. The very arteries that pumped the lifeblood of commerce and knowledge across Eurasia also carried with them microscopic agents of death that would ravage cities, decimate populations, and shatter the illusion of safety that walls and borders once promised. Centuries before the rise of modern epidemiology, humans had already unknowingly created a system that allowed disease to flourish. As merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and adventurers traversed the Silk Road, they carried with them not only goods and stories, but also fleas, rodents, and pathogens. These carriers, often hidden in bundles of grain or woven into the straw of merchant wagons, moved silently alongside human travelers. The road's caravanserais, roadside inns that provided shelter and sustenance, were particularly vulnerable spots. With travelers resting in close quarters, their animals stabled nearby, and supplies constantly arriving from distant lands, these stops became hotbeds of biological transmission. The close contact between people and animals created the ideal conditions for the plague to leap species and begin its deadly journey from one host to the next. Historical evidence suggests that the Black Death originated in the arid regions of Central Asia, perhaps near the area that is now Kyrgyzstan. From there, it moved east and west, clinging to the silk and spice routes that wound their way through the bustling trade hubs of Samarkand, Bukhara, and beyond. The Mongol Empire, which had unified vast stretches of the Silk Road under a single political order, played a paradoxical role in this process. While their control brought about an unprecedented era of stability and safety for traders, the so-called Pax Mongolica, It also facilitated a level of cross-continental movement that accelerated the spread of the disease. With Mongol messengers, merchant caravans, and migrating armies in constant motions, the plague found a superhighway through which to leapfrog from steppe to city, from oasis to port. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the siege of the Genoese trading post at Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, on the Crimean Peninsula in the mid-14th century. Here, Mongol forces, reportedly struck by the plague themselves, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls in a grim act of biological warfare. As the besieged fled by ship, they inadvertently carried the plague with them into Europe. This moment represents a critical junction between the Silk Road's eastern reaches and the Mediterranean world. The disease, having moved silently along the overland trade routes, now hitched a ride across the sea aboard trading vessels bound for Constantinople, Venice, and Marseille. Within months, the Black Death would be knocking at the doors of nearly every major European city. The rapidity with which the plague spread can be partly attributed to the economic vibrancy and interconnectedness that the Silk Road fostered. Markets in China exchanged porcelain and tea for Persian carpets and Indian spices. At every stop along this route, people gathered, touched the same goods, bartered face to face, and unknowingly exchanged far more than currency. Rats infested the granaries and docks, fleas thrived in the folds of garments and sacks of food. In a world without sanitation or germ theory, such conditions allowed the Yersinia pestis bacterium, carried by fleas and hosted by rodents, to flourish. Traders returning from the East brought not just exotic wares, but also sorrow. In cities like Florence, London, and Paris, entire neighborhoods were emptied of life within weeks. Doctors were powerless, treatments ineffective, and fear omnipresent. The same pathways that had once delivered silk, jade, and philosophical texts now brought death in silence. What's more, the plague did not discriminate. Nobles and peasants alike fell victim, though the poorest suffered disproportionately due to overcrowded living conditions and lack of resources. Religious processions and pilgrimages, often intended to seek divine intervention, only served to worsen the spread, as large groups moved from one region to another in desperation and grief. The psychological effects of the plague, intensified by its mysterious nature and terrifying mortality rate, rippled through societies connected by the Silk Road. People sought answers in religion, superstition, and scapegoating, further fracturing communities already devastated by loss. In many places, social order broke down, with laborers dying by the thousands, fields went unplowed, workshops stood empty, and economies collapsed. Some cities turned inward, closing their gates to travelers, hoping to isolate themselves from the invisible terror. But isolation proved largely futile. The web of the Silk Road was too vast, its reach too deep, its impact too profound. Despite the unimaginable suffering, the plague indirectly ushered in sweeping changes that would shape the post-medieval world. With populations diminished, labor became more valuable, leading to improved wages and social mobility for survivors in certain regions. The rigid structures of feudalism began to erode. Meanwhile, trade routes eventually reopened, this time with greater attention to cleanliness and public health. Silk Road cities that survived the plague became centers of renewal, their populations tempered by trauma but also compelled to rebuild with resilience. New medical theories began to circulate, challenging old beliefs and laying the groundwork for future scientific inquiry. The story of how the Silk Road spread the Black Death is more than just a tale of disease. It is a stark reminder of how human interconnectivity, so often a force for progress, can also serve as a conduit for catastrophe. The very fabric of civilization, stitched together by trade and communication, can unravel when an unseen threat emerges. The movement of people, goods, and ideas is never without consequence. In the case of the Black Death, it was this very movement that transformed a localized outbreak into a continental calamity. The same caravans that carried shimmering bolts of silk and the sweet scent of cloves also bore the silent sting of fleas and the invisible burden of plague. What makes the impact of the Silk Road on the Black Death especially profound is how it revealed the vulnerabilities in our shared systems: economic, social, and biological. Cities that once thrived on trade found that their open gates, once symbols of prosperity, became the very channels through which destruction entered. Families were torn apart by loss. communities forever marked by the mass graves dug in haste and despair. Yet humanity endured. From the ashes of this pandemic rose a changed world, sobered by suffering, but also inspired to seek knowledge, understanding, and protection against future horrors. In this narrative of interwoven destinies, the Silk Road is neither hero nor villain, but a mirror to our shared human condition. It reflects the duality of connection, the beauty of exchange, and the danger of exposure. The story of the Black Death's journey is a testament to the power of movement, of how a single pathogen traveling silently among silks and spices could bring empires to their knees. And though the plague eventually subsided, its passage across the Silk Road left behind a permanent scar, a mark not just on history, but on our collective memory. The Maritime Silk Road, trade winds from China to the Indian Ocean. The story of the Maritime Silk Road is one of wind, water, and the relentless drive of civilizations to connect across vast distances for trade, influence, and discovery. Long before the age of steamships and globalized commerce, the seas themselves were highways linking east and west. The Maritime Silk Road, often overshadowed by its overland counterpart, was a network of seaborne routes stretching from the eastern shores of China across the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean and far beyond. This water-based artery of trade played a pivotal role in shaping world history, facilitating not just economic transactions, but also profound cultural, technological, and ideological exchanges. Unlike the land-bound caravans that crossed deserts and mountains, the ships that traversed the Maritime Silk Road followed the rhythm of the monsoon winds. These predictable seasonal patterns became nature's timetable, dictating when a ship could safely leave port and where it could travel. Chinese merchants and sailors, particularly from the port cities of Guangzhou and Quanzhou, waited for the southwest monsoon winds to carry them toward the coasts of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. In return, the northeast monsoons brought them back, laden with goods, stories, and knowledge from distant lands. Chinese traders didn't sail alone. These routes were a mosaic of diverse seafarers, from Indian and Arab merchants to Malay navigators and Persian shipbuilders, each contributing their expertise and establishing nodes of commerce that became cosmopolitan melting pots. The cargo they carried reflected the richness of the civilizations they connected. Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware journeyed across the seas, becoming symbols of luxury and sophistication in foreign courts. In return, China welcomed back aromatic spices from the Malabar coast, ivory from East Africa, precious stones from Sri Lanka, and intricately woven textiles from India. These were not just items of trade, but vessels of meaning and symbols of status, shaping tastes and economies far from their place of origin. Maritime cities flourished along these routes. Port cities like Srivijaya in Sumatra, Calicut in India, and Aden in Yemen became hubs where languages mingled, ideas exchanged, and alliances formed. These ports were not mere pit stops for resupply. They were vibrant centers of diplomacy and cultural synthesis. Rulers built infrastructures to welcome foreign traders, from secure harbors to temples and mosques that reflected the beliefs of transient populations. The maritime routes also facilitated the spread of religions. Buddhism spread from India to Southeast Asia and eventually to China, its path smoothed by seaborne missionaries and translated scriptures. Islam, carried by Arab traders and Sufi preachers, found deep roots in coastal regions from East Africa to the Indonesian archipelago. Christianity, too, arrived in parts of India and China through these oceanic links. The Maritime Silk Road became a spiritual conduit, not merely a commercial one. The navigation techniques used were just as advanced as the goods being traded. Chinese seafarers developed sophisticated maps, compasses, and knowledge of stars and currents. Ships like the Chinese junk were marvels of engineering, capable of enduring long voyages and heavy loads. These innovations weren't isolated. They were shared and refined as knowledge flowed in both directions. Arab navigators brought their own expertise in celestial navigation and astronomy, while Indian mathematicians and scholars enriched the intellectual exchanges along the coasts. These maritime connections were not random, but strategically established over centuries of trust and interdependence. Diplomatic missions often accompanied trade voyages. Chinese dynasties such as the Tang and Song sent envoys to kingdoms along the Indian Ocean, forging alliances that secured safe passage for merchants. Gifts were exchanged, treaties negotiated, and marriages sometimes arranged, turning trade into a tool of soft power. One of the most famous figures to emerge from this world was the Ming Dynasty admiral Zheng. In the early 15th century, he led massive fleets on voyages that reached as far as East Africa. These expeditions weren't intended for conquest, but to demonstrate the grandeur of Chinese civilization and extend diplomatic ties. Zheng He's voyages exemplified the scale and ambition of the Maritime Silk Road. His fleets were floating cities, carrying not only trade goods but also craftsmen, translators, and emissaries, embodiments of China's willingness to engage with the world through peaceful exchange. The Maritime Silk Road was also an engine of technological transmission. Paper, printing techniques, gunpowder, and compass technology moved from China westward. In turn, Chinese artisans and scholars absorbed ideas from Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Arab medicine. These exchanges enriched societies, fostering advances that transcended borders. Piracy and warfare were ever-present threats on these waters. Yet the sheer volume and value of the trade encouraged the development of naval defenses and regional pacts. Merchant guilds protected their own through shared intelligence and mutual aid. Some rulers deployed fleets specifically to ensure that trade could flow without interruption. Even empires at odds often respected the sanctity of trade, understanding that commerce could be more profitable than conflict. The environmental challenges of the Maritime Silk Road were no less formidable. Ships faced typhoons, unpredictable currents, and treacherous reefs. To overcome these, seafarers developed detailed sailing charts and shared weather knowledge through oral traditions and written records. Mariners' guilds passed on wisdom from generation to generation, creating a living legacy of maritime intelligence that connected people across oceans and epochs. What made the Maritime Silk Road truly exceptional was its ability to weave together a world system long before the term existed. Goods changed hands multiple times, each transaction adding layers of meaning and value. A piece of Chinese porcelain could pass through 10 ports before reaching a royal household in Egypt, each time appreciated for a different reason: its beauty, its craftsmanship, its rarity. This layering of trade turned the Maritime Silk Road into a conveyor belt of culture. Languages borrowed words, cuisines absorbed spices, and clothing adopted patterns that had traveled thousands of miles. The road was invisible, made not of stone or silk, but of relationships, reputations, and shared trust. Ships followed in the wakes of their predecessors, guided by memory as much as by the stars. The decline of the Maritime Silk Road came with the rise of European naval powers. The Portuguese, Dutch, and later the British brought new dynamics to oceanic trade, establishing colonies and monopolies that disrupted the older, more cooperative networks. Yet even under new regimes, the bones of the old road remained. Ports that once welcomed junks and dhows now received galleons and clippers. Trade continued, albeit under new rules and often harsher conditions. The legacy of the Maritime Silk Road lives on in the port cities that still hum with multicultural energy, in the fusion cuisines of the Indian Ocean Rim, and in the linguistic traces of Chinese, Arabic, Tamil, and Malay in far-flung places. It lives in the stories of merchants who sailed with hope, ambition, and courage across unknown waters in pursuit of connection. The Maritime Silk Road is not a relic of the past. It is a blueprint for global cooperation, reminding us that long before modern globalization, the seas had already united diverse peoples through mutual respect and mutual benefit. Its spirit endures in today's shipping lanes and cultural exchanges, a timeless testament to the human desire to reach across the horizon. The echoes of the Maritime Silk Road continue to shape our present in subtle yet profound ways. Today, modern shipping routes mirror many of the ancient paths once navigated by merchants and explorers who trusted wind patterns more than modern GPS. In many of the same harbors, Guangzhou, Malacca, Colombo, one can still feel the heartbeat of trade, where goods and ideas arrive daily, just as they did centuries ago. The Maritime Silk Road left more than just artifacts in museums. It etched itself into the architecture, customs, and even the genetic makeup of port populations, where intermarriage among diverse communities forged entirely new cultures. This fusion is visible in language blends, hybrid art styles, and even culinary innovations that feature ingredients and cooking techniques from opposite ends of the continent. The cultural tolerance that thrived in those maritime crossroads reminds us that cooperation, rather than domination, is the more sustainable route. The model of trade fostered by the Maritime Silk Road was decentralized and adaptable, built on negotiation and mutual gain rather than force. In this lies a valuable lesson for our increasingly interconnected world. Openness, respect, and shared knowledge lead to enduring prosperity. As global initiatives today seek to revive maritime connections for economic integration, they echo the timeless logic of that ancient seaborne network. The Maritime Silk Road was not simply a route of commerce, it was a living current of civilization, continuously shaped by those who dared to sail into the unknown, trusting that the horizon always held something worth discovering. The decline, how gunpowder, empire, and new routes ended the Silk Road. The decline of the Silk Road was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling shaped by powerful geopolitical shifts, technological innovations, and changing economic incentives. For centuries, the Silk Road had thrived as a sprawling network of overland routes that connected China with the Mediterranean, passing through Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East. Caravans carried silk, spices, ceramics, jewels, and ideas across daunting deserts and towering mountain passes. But by the time the early modern era dawned, the very forces that once supported this immense system began to conspire against it. The introduction of gunpowder into warfare, the rise of powerful empires with shifting borders and priorities, and the emergence of new maritime trade routes redefined the way the world moved goods. And with that, the Silk Road gradually faded into history. One of the most profound changes came with the increasing use of gunpowder, a Chinese invention that had originally been developed for fireworks and small-scale weaponry. As it spread westward through the Mongol Empire and reached the Middle East and Europe, gunpowder revolutionized the art of war. Cannons could now breach ancient walls that had withstood invasions for centuries. Fortresses once seen as impenetrable were rendered vulnerable. As warfare evolved, so did the priorities of empires. The defense of overland caravan routes became more difficult and costly. Raids, banditry, and armed conflict in border regions grew more frequent, threatening traders and reducing the reliability of the Silk Road. What was once a reasonably secure conduit of commerce became a dangerous gamble, prompting merchants to seek safer alternatives. At the same time, the rise and fall of great empires reshaped the landscape. The Mongol Empire had once unified much of Eurasia under one rule, allowing the Silk Road to flourish in a rare moment of peace and relative security. But as this empire fragmented, its constituent khanates turned inward or fell into conflict. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and others lost their cohesion and stability. Local warlords began imposing heavy tolls or seizing merchant goods outright. Fragmentation created uncertainty and made long-distance overland trade increasingly untenable. New powers arose, such as the Timurids and later the Safavids and Ottomans, who had their own agendas and rivalries. Trade became entangled in the complex web of imperial diplomacy, taxes, and territorial disputes. For merchants, the cost and risk of navigating these unstable corridors grew too high to justify the journey. As the Ottoman Empire expanded westward and eventually captured Constantinople in 1453, they gained control over critical junctions of the old Silk Road. While trade continued under their oversight, the costs increased. The Ottomans recognized the strategic power of controlling the flow of goods between East and West and used it as leverage in their diplomatic and military confrontations with European powers. In response, Europeans began searching for ways to circumvent the traditional overland routes altogether. The need to bypass these costly intermediaries led to a wave of maritime exploration that would transform global commerce forever. It was during this period that European explorers, driven by a mix of economic ambition and technological advances, took to the seas in search of direct access to the riches of the East. Portugal led the charge, with Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, opening a sea route to India. This new pathway offered merchants a way to transport spices, silk, and other luxury goods without the long and perilous land journey across Central Asia. Soon, other maritime powers followed. Spain, the Netherlands, and later Britain all establishing direct trade relations with Asian powers through naval might and colonial expansion. The oceans, once barriers, became the new highways of international trade. Ships could carry greater volumes of goods more safely and cheaply than caravans. Ports like Calicut, Malacca, and Guangzhou emerged as vital hubs of maritime commerce, eclipsing traditional inland cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar. These inland centers, once vibrant with cultural exchange and economic activity, began to wither as trade routes reoriented toward the coasts. As seaborne commerce expanded, so too did the reach of European colonial empires, which began establishing fortified trading posts and colonies along the shores of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This new system of trade networks, anchored by naval power and bolstered by industrializing economies, rendered the Silk Road obsolete. The decline of the Silk Road was also fueled by the changing nature of what was being traded. While silk and spices remained valuable, the emergence of mass-produced goods in Europe and colonial commodities like sugar, tobacco, and cotton shifted global trade dynamics. These products were more efficiently transported by ship than by camel. Moreover, the cultural and intellectual exchanges that had once flourished along the Silk Road began taking new forms. Print culture, enabled by the printing press and maritime communication networks, became the primary conduits for sharing ideas, reducing the Silk Road's role as a bridge between civilizations. Disease also played a role in reshaping perceptions of overland routes. The Black Death, which had traveled westward along trade paths, deeply scarred Eurasia. Although the pandemic occurred in the 14th century, its memory lingered, reinforcing fears of contagion associated with long-distance travel across multiple territories and unfamiliar populations. Maritime routes, while not immune to disease transmission, allowed greater control of port quarantines and medical inspections, making them appear safer in comparison. These practical considerations further tilted global trade toward the oceans. In China, the Ming Dynasty's maritime ambitions briefly flared with the voyages of Admiral Zhang, whose grand fleets reached as far as East Africa in the early 15th century. These journeys demonstrated China's potential for maritime dominance, but they were abruptly halted by court officials wary of external influence and internal instability. The resulting inward turn closed China off from many international trade relationships, just as European powers were aggressively expanding their global presence. As China reduced its participation in overland and maritime exchange, the Silk Road lost one of its vital anchors. The retreat of Chinese engagement, both diplomatically and economically, contributed to the isolation of once thriving routes. Meanwhile, technological developments in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography allowed European powers to strengthen their maritime empires. The invention of the caravel, improvements in compass accuracy, and better maps made long-distance sea travel increasingly viable and profitable. With every successful voyage, confidence grew. Sea routes, which had once seemed dangerous and unpredictable, became the new norm. The overland passages, once the lifeline of transcontinental trade, began to seem archaic, too slow, too uncertain, and too limited in scale to compete. By the 17th century, the shift was complete. The Silk Road no longer held the economic and cultural centrality it once did. The cities that had thrived along its arteries adapted where they could or declined into obscurity. Caravanserais emptied, trade bazaars fell silent, and the great routes that had once united east and west were overtaken by sand and silence. Travelers still came, explorers, pilgrims, and scholars, but the grand flow of commerce had moved elsewhere. The symbolic decline of the Silk Road represented more than just a change in logistics. It marked a turning point in world history, the transition from a Eurasian-centered trade network to a truly global economy dominated by sea power. The empires of the sea, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, redrew the maps of wealth and influence. The interconnected world of overland trade that had once depended on cooperation among distant peoples gave way to a world shaped by colonialism, industrialization, and naval supremacy. Even as the Silk Road's commercial relevance diminished, its legacy endured. The cities it once nourished remained cultural treasures. The languages, religions, and artistic traditions that had mingled along its roads continued to influence their regions for generations. In modern times, the Silk remembered not only as a commercial pathway, but as a symbol of human curiosity, cultural exchange, and the enduring desire to connect across vast distances. In many ways, the very idea of the Silk Road has outlived its physical reality. It serves as a metaphor for connectivity in an age of global networks and digital frontiers. Yet its decline reminds us that no system is immune to change. Technological shifts, political upheaval, and new patterns of ambition can upend even the most enduring institutions. The story of the Silk Road's end is thus not a tale of sudden collapse, but of gradual transformation, a process through which the world reinvented itself, trading camels for caravels and desert paths for ocean currents. The Silk Road as a human story, exchange beyond goods. For millennia, the Silk Road was far more than a mere trade route linking the east to the west. It was a vast network of paths threading through mountains, deserts, and valleys, a living artery of human connection that transcended the simple exchange of commodities. The story of the Silk Road is the story of people, of dreams, hardships, hopes, and the ceaseless curiosity that defines the human spirit. It was a corridor where cultures intertwined, ideas blossomed, and the very fabric of civilizations was woven through interaction. The goods that traveled along these routes, silk, spices, precious metals, and stones, were but symbols of the greater exchanges taking place. Languages, religions, philosophies, art, and technologies crossed borders and boundaries as freely as caravans crossed deserts. Far from a linear path, the Silk Road was a sprawling network of routes that shifted and changed with the tides of politics, war, and nature. Traders, pilgrims, envoys, and adventurers all journeyed along these trails, driven by different motivations, but linked by a common purpose: connection. Every step they took, every oasis they reached, and every market they entered was a moment where human stories intersected. These were not just transactions, but acts of trust, hospitality, and shared curiosity. Caravan leaders and merchants had to negotiate not only prices, but alliances and cultural nuances, learning the languages and customs of those they encountered. The act of trade was as much a social ritual as it was an economic one, creating bonds that could bridge distant empires. Along these routes, the Silk Road nurtured urban centers that became melting pots of ethnicity and culture. Cities such as Samarkand, Kashgar, and Dunhuang flourished, their bazaars echoing with the voices of many tongues. These cities were not only commercial hubs, but also centers of learning, where scholars translated texts from one language to another, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Buddhist monasteries stood alongside Zoroastrian fire temples and Nestorian churches, exemplifying a world where religious ideas were exchanged with as much zeal as material goods. This mingling of faiths, philosophies, and artistic traditions forged a cultural cosmopolitanism rarely seen elsewhere in the ancient world. The human dimension of the Silk Road was also marked by the perilous journeys undertaken by countless individuals. Traders faced extreme climates, from the freezing heights of the Pamirs to the blistering sands of the Taklamakan Desert. Bandits and political upheaval posed constant threats, and many caravans never completed their voyages. Yet, the desire for exchange persisted despite these dangers, highlighting a profound human resilience and determination. Alongside merchants, missionaries, and diplomats risked their lives to spread their beliefs or forge alliances, weaving a tapestry of interregional diplomacy and spiritual outreach. Stories of individuals who braved unknown lands inspired generations, blending fact and legend in the collective memory of the Silk Road. Trade on the Silk Road was not one-sided. It was a reciprocal flow that shaped all participants. The Chinese, renowned for silk production, found markets hungry for their delicate fabric, while the West introduced glassware, precious gems, and horses prized for their strength. But beyond goods, the most transformative exchanges were intellectual and technological. Papermaking, invented in China, traveled westward and revolutionized communication. Gunpowder, originally a Chinese invention, would later change warfare across continents. The stirrup, a seemingly simple invention, revolutionized cavalry tactics and spread through Eurasia via these trade routes. Such innovations crossed borders not as isolated phenomena, but as shared heritage, illustrating how human ingenuity was nurtured in contact zones created by commerce. Language and writing systems also evolved under the influence of Silk Road interactions. Sogdian merchants, who played a pivotal role in the trade, acted as cultural intermediaries. their language becoming a lingua franca in many trading cities. This common tongue facilitated not just trade, but the transmission of stories, religious texts, and scientific knowledge. Manuscripts in multiple languages were copied, annotated, and carried along these routes, preserving the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. The Silk Road became a vector for literacy and scholarship, where the act of writing itself was a treasured craft that linked distant peoples through shared narratives. The transmission of religions along the Silk Road offers one of the most compelling illustrations of human exchange beyond material goods. Buddhism, originating in India, spread through Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan, facilitated by merchants and monks who traveled the trade routes. Alongside Buddhism, Manichaeism, Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism found footholds, sometimes coexisting and other times competing for adherence. The Silk Road became a spiritual highway where sacred texts and religious art were traded and adapted, producing syncretic traditions that reflected the complexities of human belief and identity. This spiritual exchange contributed to the Silk Road's reputation not just as a commercial network, but as a cradle of intercultural dialogue. Food and culinary traditions, too, were transformed by the Silk Road's human currents. Spices from India and Southeast Asia flavored dishes across the continent, introducing tastes that would become staples far from their points of origin. The diffusion of crops such as grapes, melons, and pomegranates reshaped agriculture and diets in many regions, while cooking techniques and recipes adapted to local climates and cultures. Shared meals in caravanserais, roadside inns where travelers rested, became occasions for social interaction and cultural exchange, strengthening bonds among diverse peoples. The Silk Road, in this sense, was a corridor of taste and nourishment that enriched the daily lives of its travelers. Artistic influences also spread widely through the Silk Road, creating unique hybrid styles visible in textiles, pottery, and sculpture. Motifs from Hellenistic art blended with Buddhist iconography in Central Asia, producing masterpieces that expressed shared aesthetics and religious sentiments. The famous murals of Dunhuang reveal a confluence of Indian, Persian, and Chinese styles, tend to the creative possibilities unlocked by cultural interaction. These artworks were more than decoration. They were visual narratives that communicated beliefs, values, and histories, acting as silent ambassadors of the human experience across the vast Silk Road. The role of women on the Silk Road is often overlooked but remains a vital thread in its human story. Women served as traders, translators, and cultural mediators, navigating the complex social worlds that connected East and West. Some women managed caravans or controlled market spaces, exercising agency in economies that stretched across continents. Marriage alliances sometimes served diplomatic and commercial purposes, weaving familial ties that transcended ethnic and national boundaries. The lives and stories of these women reveal the multifaceted human networks sustaining Silk Road societies and challenge simplified notions of ancient trade as solely male-driven. Hospitality and the customs of welcoming strangers were central to Silk Road life. Caravanserais dotted the routes, offering shelter, food, and rest to weary travelers, regardless of their origin or faith. These inns were places where news was exchanged, friendships forged, and mutual understanding cultivated. In a world where trust was often a scarce commodity, such acts of generosity were crucial for survival and the continuity of commerce. The ritual of hospitality was a binding human value, transcending cultures and fostering the peaceful coexistence necessary for the Silk Road's prosperity. The Silk Road also enabled the spread of medical knowledge and practices. Physicians and herbalists traveled with caravans, sharing remedies and techniques that blended Greek, Indian, Chinese, and Persian traditions. Medical texts were translated and disseminated, enriching the understanding of health and healing across vast distances. These exchanges improved the well-being of countless individuals, highlighting how the Silk Road facilitated not only material wealth but also human welfare and knowledge. Political dynamics shaped the Silk Road's human narrative in profound ways. Empires rose and fell, but the desire for trade and connection persisted. The Pax Mongolica, established under the Mongol Empire, is one of the most famous examples where political stability enabled a flourishing of Silk Road activity. Under Mongol rule, the safety of travelers was prioritized, allowing unprecedented volumes of goods and ideas to move with reduced risk. This era also saw increased diplomatic exchanges between distant courts, linking Eurasian powers through marriage, envoy missions, and treaties. The Silk Road thus became a stage for human ambition and statecraft, where commerce and politics were intricately intertwined. The environmental challenges of the Silk Road tested the adaptability of those who traveled it. Navigating treacherous mountain passes, vast deserts, and unpredictable rivers required detailed knowledge of the land and seasons. Local guides and indigenous communities played an essential role in ensuring the safety and success of caravans. Their expertise in finding water sources, understanding weather patterns, and managing pack animals was invaluable. This local knowledge underscored the Silk Road as a deeply human enterprise, dependent on collaboration between diverse peoples intimately connected to their environment. The Silk Road was also a crucible for storytelling, where myths, legends, and oral histories were exchanged and transformed. Travelers carried tales of distant lands, heroic deeds, and spiritual revelations, enriching the imaginations of those they met. These stories often adapted to new cultural contexts, blending elements to resonate with local audiences. Such narrative exchanges fostered a shared human heritage, weaving connections of identity and meaning that transcended geography. Economic innovation thrived along the Silk Road, reflecting the ingenuity of the humans involved. The development of credit systems, letters of credit, and trade agreements reflected complex financial arrangements that minimized risk and maximized profit. Merchants developed sophisticated networks of agents and partnerships, allowing goods to flow smoothly across vast distances. These economic practices laid the foundations for modern commerce and demonstrated the Silk Road's role as a laboratory for human creativity in business. Education and the transmission of knowledge were central to the Silk Road's legacy. Centers of learning emerged, where scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. The translation movements that took place in places like Baghdad and Samarkand facilitated the cross-pollination of Greek, Indian, Persian, and Chinese scientific knowledge. This fusion of ideas contributed to significant advancements that would influence civilizations for centuries. The Silk Road was not just a path of trade, but a conduit for intellectual growth and the expansion of human understanding. Despite the vast distances, the Silk Road fostered a sense of interconnectedness among its participants. Shared challenges and goals created communities of interest that transcended ethnic and cultural divides. The empathy and cooperation that emerged were essential for maintaining the flow of goods and ideas. This human network of trust and exchange challenges modern notions of ancient isolation, showing a world where distant peoples were intimately linked by their shared humanity. Artisans and craftsmen along the Silk Road adapted and innovated as they encountered new materials and techniques. Pottery styles changed as influences traveled from one region to another, while textile designs incorporated motifs inspired by faraway cultures. Such creative exchanges reflect the Silk Road's role as a catalyst for artistic evolution and cultural hybridity. These artisans were active participants in the ongoing dialogue between civilizations, shaping material culture that bore witness to the human story of exchange. The role of children and families in Silk Road societies was integral but often understated. Families traveled together in caravans, sharing the burdens and benefits of trade. Children learned languages, survival skills, and commerce from an early age, preparing to carry forward the legacy of connection. The transmission of culture and knowledge within families was a key element in sustaining the human networks that underpinned Silk Road commerce. These generational links ensured the continuity of human stories across time and space. The Silk Road also played a role in shaping concepts of identity and belonging. As people moved and mingled, they encountered new customs and beliefs, which sometimes challenged their sense of self. The resulting cultural encounters often led to hybrid identities, where individuals and communities blended elements from multiple traditions. This dynamic process reveals the Silk Road as a space of negotiation and transformation, where human identity was continuously reshaped through exchange. Trade on the Silk Road was not merely an economic activity, but a performative act filled with rituals, ceremonies, and symbolism. The exchange of gifts between merchants and rulers was laden with meaning, signaling alliances and respect. Religious rituals were performed to ensure safe passage and successful transactions. These acts reflected the deeply social nature of trade, highlighting how commerce was embedded within broader cultural frameworks and human relationships. The impact of the Silk Road extended beyond Eurasia, influencing regions in Africa and the Indian Ocean. Maritime routes connected with overland paths, creating a global network of exchange. The movement of peoples and goods facilitated cultural diffusion that shaped distant societies. This broader context positions the Silk Road within a larger human story of global interconnectedness, emphasizing that no civilization existed in isolation. The decline of the Silk Road did not erase its human legacy. Even as new sea routes emerged, the cultural and intellectual exchanges fostered over centuries continued to influence societies. The ideas, technologies, and art forms transmitted along these routes persisted, becoming embedded in the fabric of many civilizations. The human stories of curiosity, adaptation, and connection endure as testimony to the power of exchange beyond material goods. The Silk Road as a human story reminds us that history is not only about empires or economics, but about the individuals who dared to venture beyond their horizons. Their journeys shaped the world we know today, laying the groundwork for the interconnected global society we inhabit. The lessons of tolerance, curiosity, and cooperation embedded in the Silk Road's history continue to inspire, inviting us to recognize our shared humanity across the divides of culture and geography. Empires and Silk, the Han Dynasty's role in opening the East. The story of the Silk Road cannot be told without recognizing the monumental role played by the Han Dynasty in shaping and sustaining this grand artery of exchange between East and West. In a world fragmented by mountains, deserts, and hostile tribes, it took the vision of a centralized empire, one with both ambition and administrative strength, to lay down the groundwork for one of the most significant trade routes in history. The Han Dynasty, ruling from 206 BCE to 220 CE, provided not only the political framework but also the economic incentives and military protection necessary to initiate what would become a transcontinental corridor of ideas, goods, and influence. Long before the name Silk Road was coined by modern historians, Chinese silk was already making its way to distant lands, prized by Roman elites and Middle Eastern merchants alike. But the thread connecting distant regions into a recognizable network truly began under Han guidance. At the heart of the Han strategy was a recognition of geography, not just the physical terrain, but the geopolitical reality of their time. The Han court understood that to thrive economically and diplomatically, they could not remain isolated. The lands to the west held not only resources, but also potential allies against common enemies. This realization became clear during the reign of Emperor Wu, one of the most dynamic rulers in Chinese history. Determined to break the isolation imposed by nomadic threats like the Xiongnu, he initiated a series of missions aimed at forging ties with Central Asian tribes. Among these efforts, none proved more consequential than the expedition led by Zhang Qian. Though his journey took over a decade and was fraught with captivity and setbacks, the intelligence he brought back changed the empire's worldview. Zhang Qian's report revealed a vast array of civilizations and trade opportunities far beyond what the Han court had imagined. It sparked a political and economic awakening that would ripple across the continent. With this newfound awareness came action. The Han Dynasty invested in infrastructure that would support long-distance movement. Roads, relay stations, and military outposts were constructed across critical stretches of territory, transforming isolated frontiers into interconnected passageways. These measures served multiple purposes. They facilitated the movement of troops, enabled communication between distant provinces, and crucially supported the caravans that would come to define the Silk Road experience. Security was paramount. Trade could not flourish in a climate of fear, and so the Han deployed considerable resources to patrol and protect vulnerable routes, especially in the treacherous Hexi corridor and through the Taklamakan Desert. These efforts made it possible for merchants, pilgrims, and emissaries to undertake arduous journeys with some degree of confidence. Silk, of course, was the symbol of this burgeoning exchange. Lightweight, durable, and luxurious, It captivated foreign markets from India and Persia to the far reaches of the Roman Empire. But the Silk Road was never just about silk. The Han were eager importers of exotic goods, including horses, grapes, glassware, and spices. They also absorbed new ideas, technologies, and even religious influences, enriching Chinese society in unexpected ways. It was under the Han that Buddhism, carried along the Silk Road by traveling monks and missionaries, first began to take root in Chinese soil. The exchange was far more than commercial, it was cultural and ideological, laying the foundations for a more interconnected Asia. One of the most overlooked yet critical aspects of the Han Dynasty's involvement in the Silk Road was their diplomatic strategy. Trade was not seen as an isolated economic activity, but was embedded in the broader framework of foreign policy. The Han government often sent emissaries bearing gifts to foreign courts, establishing networks of loyalty and mutual benefit. This created a system of reciprocal exchanges that sometimes blurred the line between tribute and trade. It also allowed the Han to influence affairs in distant lands without direct military intervention. Through these networks, they gained intelligence, secured alliances, and promoted stability along the routes their merchants relied on. This approach required a delicate balancing act, respecting the autonomy of distant powers while asserting Han prestige. The expansion of the Silk Road during the Han era also led to a transformation in domestic policy. The imperial court began to regulate trade more systematically, recognizing its potential for revenue and political leverage. Taxation systems were refined and officials were appointed to oversee key trading hubs. Markets along the western frontiers began to thrive, attracting not only Han Chinese but also traders from Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. This multicultural environment fostered innovation, particularly in the realms of art and craftsmanship. New motifs, materials, and techniques entered Chinese workshops, leading to a blending of styles that would define Han-era luxury goods. Despite these achievements, maintaining the Silk Road was no simple task. The terrain was unforgiving and the political landscape constantly shifting. Nomadic tribes continued to pose a threat, and internal revolts periodically disrupted the stability necessary for trade to function. But the Han showed remarkable adaptability. When direct control over certain territories proved unsustainable, they sought influence through client states and strategic marriages. They also invested in intelligence networks to monitor developments across the region, ensuring that they could respond quickly to threats or opportunities. These mechanisms allowed the Han Dynasty to maintain a measure of control over a vast and volatile frontier. The Silk Road's success under the Han was not merely a matter of statecraft or military strength. It was also a triumph of imagination. It required the Han leadership to envision a world in which China was not the center of a self-contained universe, but a participant in a broader, dynamic network. This vision was revolutionary. It challenged traditional notions of sovereignty and reshaped how the Chinese state perceived its role in the world. It was a bold assertion that wealth, influence, and cultural development could be amplified through openness rather than isolation. This mindset had profound implications for future dynasties, many of which would look back to the Han as a model for outward engagement. The Han dynasty's role in opening the East through the Silk Road also had a long-lasting impact on the global historical trajectory. Their efforts made it possible for Eastern and Western civilizations to interact in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few generations earlier. Philosophies, medical knowledge, astronomical data, and artistic practices began to traverse borders, creating a shared pool of human achievement. The seeds of globalization, in a sense, were planted during this period, and the Han dynasty was among its first gardeners. Even after the fall of the Han, the legacy of their Silk Road innovations endured. Successor states attempted to replicate the administrative and diplomatic frameworks they had pioneered. The roads remained, as did the cultural connections, enabling future trade and interaction during the Tang and Yuan periods. The Han had done more than create a trade route. They had forged a path of possibility, one that would shape the destiny of nations long after their own empire faded into history. What remains remarkable about the Han dynasty's role in opening the East is how deeply strategic and forward-thinking it was. They did not simply stumble upon a trade route. They cultivated it with care. investing in both the hard infrastructure of roads and outposts and the soft infrastructure of diplomacy and cultural exchange. They understood that power was not merely about conquest, but about connectivity. In doing so, they not only enriched their own civilization, but helped to weave together a broader human story, one that continues to unfold along the ancient trails they once forged. Caravans and deserts, the harsh realities of crossing Central Asia. The vast expanse of Central Asia has always held a mysterious allure, drawing merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers across its formidable terrain. Yet behind this romantic vision lies a harsh and unforgiving reality. Crossing the deserts and mountains of Central Asia was not merely a journey, it was a test of endurance, adaptability, and sheer human will. Caravans braving these lands moved with the knowledge that every mile could bring new dangers. Blistering heat, biting cold, sandstorms, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present threat of bandits or political unrest. This unforgiving landscape shaped the nature of trade and travel in the region, influencing everything from the size of a caravan to the choice of animals and the strategic planning of rest stops at vital oases. Life in a caravan was a study in hardship. The day would often begin well before dawn, under the faint glimmer of starlight, as travelers prepared for long hours of relentless motion. The blazing sun would soon rise, beating down without mercy on both people and animals. Dust clung to every surface, stung the eyes, and filled the lungs. With each step, hooves sank into the loose sand, and wagon wheels creaked and groaned under the weight of goods, silks, spices, gemstones, and medicinal herbs, all bound for distant markets. There was little comfort to be found, even at night. The cold descended suddenly and with force, leaving travelers huddled around flickering campfires, wrapped in coarse blankets, listening to the wind howl across the dunes or sweep down from the frozen mountains. Animals played an indispensable role in the survival of a caravan. Camels, especially the Bactrian variety with their thick fur and twin humps, were uniquely adapted to endure the scorching summers and freezing winters of the region. These stoic creatures could go for days without water, traverse rocky paths, and bear heavy loads. Horses, prized for their speed and agility, served scouts and messengers, while donkeys and mules carried supplies. But even these animals were vulnerable. Sudden sandstorms could disorient entire groups, leading to separation, injuries, or the loss of precious cargo. Diseases would break out among livestock, forcing traders to make hard choices about which goods to abandon or which animals to sacrifice for the survival of the whole group. The human toll was no less severe. Many who joined these expeditions were not wealthy merchants, but hired hands, porters, camel drivers, guards, who endured the brunt of the journey's hardship for a meager wage. Food was always a concern. Supplies had to be carefully rationed, and what was carried was often simple and bland: dried meat, hard flatbreads, and fermented mare's milk. Clean water was a rare luxury, often drawn from questionable wells or brackish pools. Illness could sweep through a caravan rapidly, and without proper medicine, even a minor infection could prove fatal. Injuries from accidents, falls, or exhaustion were common, and rest was a privilege that came only with the setting sun. In many cases, the success of a caravan rested on the endurance of its least privileged members. Political instability added yet another layer of danger. Central Asia was a patchwork of kingdoms, khanates, and tribal lands, each with its own laws and rivalries. Caravans had to negotiate their way across these territories with diplomacy, gifts, or bribes. At times, rulers demanded exorbitant taxes, while at others, suspicion of espionage led to detainments or confiscation of goods. In some regions, lawlessness prevailed and banditry became a serious threat. Bandits knew the caravan routes well and would strike in remote areas, stripping traders of their wares and leaving them to fend for themselves. Many caravans traveled with armed escorts, and some even joined together in temporary alliances to increase their numbers and safety. But even then, no journey was truly secure. Oases were the lifeblood of these desert crossings. These rare green patches provided not only water and shade, but a brief moment of respite from the punishing journey. Some oases developed into thriving towns, bustling with activity as caravans paused to rest, trade, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. Here, news traveled with the speed of the camel's stride, stories of other caravans, shifting alliances, or upcoming threats. It was in these interludes that the desert temporarily transformed into a place of cultural exchange, where languages blended, religions crossed paths, and ideas were traded alongside silk and jade. But the stay was always temporary. Caravans could not afford to linger too long. The desert demanded motion and punished delay. Weather was an unpredictable adversary. Temperatures could swing from sweltering highs during the day to freezing lows at night. In some areas, fierce winds kicked up blinding sandstorms, burying entire paths and rendering visibility to nothing. In the highlands and mountain passes, sudden blizzards could trap caravans, forcing them to halt for days or abandon their routes entirely. Rain, though rare, could transform dry wadis into raging torrents, cutting off passage and washing away supplies. Nature showed little mercy, and the success of a journey often depended on the wisdom of guides who knew how to read the land, anticipate shifts in the weather, and navigate through terrain where no clear markers existed. The psychological burden of these treks was also immense. Isolation was constant. For days or even weeks, the caravan would pass through nothing but sand, rock, or snow-covered emptiness. Monotony and fatigue set in, and with them came doubt and fear. The silence of the desert was broken only by the crunch of hooves, the low grumble of the wind, or the occasional cry of a beast. Relationships within the caravan were tested. Tensions flared, trust was strained, and leadership was often challenged. Superstitions flourished in this environment. Many travelers carried charms, invoked prayers, or observed rituals to ward off misfortune. Dreams of wealth at the end of the road kept spirits alive, but not all who started the journey would see its end. Despite these hardships, the caravans of Central Asia persisted for centuries, forming the arteries of one of the greatest commercial networks in human history. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a shifting web of routes, shaped by geography, politics, and the will of those who dared to cross it. Each caravan was a microcosm of human perseverance, men and women defying the odds to connect distant worlds. Every successful crossing contributed to the global exchange of goods, art, and knowledge, enriching cultures far beyond the deserts they traversed. Yet every successful crossing was also a quiet victory against nature's indifference, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming adversity. The memory of these journeys lives on not only in ancient manuscripts and merchant records, but in the collective identity of regions once connected by caravan trails. The very character of cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv bears the imprint of these perilous exchanges. Their architecture, their marketplaces, and their traditions are echoes of a time when life and commerce flowed through the sands, carried on the backs of camels, and etched into the resolve of those who dared the journey. While modern transportation has replaced the caravan trails with railroads and highways, the legacy remains embedded in the culture and landscape of Central Asia. In the end, to understand the Silk Road is to understand the human cost behind the commerce. The days scorched by the sun, the nights shivering under stars, the weary feet and calloused hands, the empty stomachs and hopeful hearts. It is to honor the thousands who walked, rode, and labored across a continent, driven not just by the lure of profit, but by the unquenchable desire to reach beyond the horizon. The deserts of Central Asia were never passive backdrops to trade. They were active, daunting forces that shaped every step of the journey. And it was in meeting those challenges that the true story of the caravan was written. The spread of religion, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity along the Silk Road. The Silk Road was more than a network of trade routes. It was a living artery of human civilization that carried not just silk, spices, and precious metals, but also the ideas, beliefs, and hopes of entire cultures. Stretching from the imperial capitals of China to the shores of the Mediterranean, this ancient route served as a bridge between worlds, both physically and spiritually. Among the most profound legacies left by centuries of interaction along the Silk Road was the transmission of religion. Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity all found fertile ground along this vast corridor, adapting to new environments and reshaping the cultural and spiritual landscapes of regions they entered. The spread of these religions was not merely a matter of conquest or decree, but a complex process of cultural exchange, personal encounters, and subtle transformations, often carried on the backs of traders, pilgrims, monks, and scholars who traveled through deserts, mountains, and marketplaces. Buddhism began its long journey from India, where it was born in the 6th century BCE, spreading through the Silk Road into Central Asia and eventually reaching China, Korea, and Japan. It did not march as an empire might, but moved with a quiet persistence, borne by monks and merchants who introduced its teachings to oasis towns and caravan cities. Buddhist monks traveled along with traders, offering spiritual guidance, translating scriptures into local languages, and establishing monasteries that served as both religious sanctuaries and hubs of cultural learning. These monasteries provided shelter and hospitality for travelers, and in doing so became essential nodes in the network of Silk Road exchange. Local rulers often embraced Buddhism, attracted by its emphasis on morality, compassion, and order, which provided a valuable framework for governance and social harmony. Over time, Buddhist art and iconography flourished in cave temples carved into remote cliffs and mountain passes, reflecting the rich cross-cultural influences absorbed along the journey. As centuries passed, Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE and began to follow similar routes of transmission. Initially spread through conquest in the early years of its rise, the continued expansion of Islam across Central Asia and into China was largely facilitated through trade and peaceful exchange. Muslim traders established themselves in the vibrant cities along the Silk Road, from Samarkand to Kashgar, blending commerce with faith. These traders not only brought goods like glassware, textiles, and spices, but also carried copies of the Quran and knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, and art. Mosques began to appear in foreign cities, and local communities found in Islam a comprehensive way of life that addressed spiritual, ethical, and legal matters. The adaptability of Islamic teachings allowed it to be embraced in diverse cultural contexts, often blending with local customs while retaining its core principles. Sufi mystics in particular played a crucial role in this spiritual expansion. Their poetic expressions, musical gatherings, and spiritual teachings opened hearts across linguistic and ethnic boundaries, making Islam not just a faith, but a vibrant cultural force along the route. Christianity, too, found its way into the Silk Road narrative. As early as the first few centuries of the Common Era, Christian missionaries, particularly from the Nestorian tradition, ventured into Persia, Central Asia, and even as far as China. These early Christians were part of the Eastern Church, whose theological and liturgical traditions had developed in Syriac-speaking communities far from the Roman centers of the West. As the Silk Road facilitated encounters between East and West, these missionaries translated Christian texts into local languages and established churches in far-flung regions. Their efforts resulted in the emergence of Christian enclaves in unlikely places, often coexisting with Buddhist and Zoroastrian communities in relative harmony. Evidence of their presence has been uncovered in archaeological findings, including crosses etched into cave walls and ancient manuscripts that blended Christian theology with local philosophical ideas. Though often marginalized and facing challenges under changing political regimes, these Christian communities demonstrated the capacity of faith to traverse enormous distances and find relevance in unfamiliar settings. The movement of religion along the Silk Road was rarely uniform or unidirectional. Instead, it involved intricate layers of interaction, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Religious ideas were not simply adopted wholesale, they were digested and reshaped by the cultures they encountered. In China, for instance, Buddhism interacted deeply with Taoist and Confucian traditions, resulting in uniquely Chinese schools of thought such as Qian Buddhism. Similarly, in Central Asia, Islamic thought was influenced by pre-Islamic Persian culture and local traditions, leading to a flourishing of literature, science, and architecture under Muslim patronage. Even Christianity, though less dominant in these regions, left behind traces that spoke to the syncretic nature of religious identity on the Silk Road. Interfaith dialogue was not always peaceful, yet the close proximity of different religious communities often led to mutual respect and occasional collaboration. Religious tolerance was sometimes a pragmatic necessity in multicultural cities where diversity was an everyday reality. It is also important to recognize the role of political powers in shaping the religious landscape of the Silk Road. Rulers often patronized one religion over others, not merely out of personal conviction, but as a strategy for unifying diverse populations or aligning with powerful neighbors. The Tang dynasty in China supported Buddhism and permitted foreign religions, including Christianity and Zoroastrianism, to operate freely for a time. Likewise, the Abbasid Caliphate fostered an intellectual culture where scholars of multiple faiths contributed to scientific and philosophical advancements. Even Mongol rulers like Kublai Khan and his predecessors engaged with religious leaders from many traditions, sometimes promoting Buddhism, other times favoring Islam or Christianity, depending on political and diplomatic interests. This tolerance created pockets of vibrant interreligious activity that left a lasting legacy on the region's cultural identity. The artistic impact of these religious movements was equally profound. Buddhist murals in Dunhuang caves, Islamic geometric patterns in caravanserais, and Christian frescoes in remote Central Asian churches all testify to the extraordinary exchange of visual traditions. These artworks were not only expressions of faith, but also cultural bridges, drawing on the aesthetics of multiple civilizations. Calligraphy, architecture, music, and storytelling were all transformed by these encounters, producing hybrid forms that still resonate with beauty and depth. Such creative syntheses revealed how deeply religion influenced not only private devotion, but public life, education, and the very architecture of cities that rose along the Silk Road. Language also played a vital role in the spread of religion. Monks, imams, and priests undertook the painstaking task of translating sacred texts into local tongues, preserving their meanings while adapting their expressions. The translation of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese required not only linguistic skill, but philosophical interpretation to reconcile different worldviews. Likewise, Arabic became the lingua franca of Islamic scholarship, connecting scholars from different regions in a shared intellectual tradition. Syriac and Persian served similar roles for Christian and Zoroastrian texts, creating a vibrant mosaic of languages that enriched religious discourse and preserved it for future generations. Despite the spiritual enrichment the Silk Road facilitated, religious transmission was not without its challenges. Conflicts occasionally erupted when beliefs clashed or when political authorities viewed foreign religions as threats. There were periods when Buddhist communities faced suppression, when Christian churches were destroyed, or when certain interpretations of Islam were outlawed. Yet, even in times of turmoil, the resilience of religious traditions often found new ways to survive. Faith adapted, transformed, and found new adherents willing to carry it further down the road. Pilgrimage routes crisscrossed the trade routes, and sacred relics were transported across vast distances, infusing the terrain with a shared sense of sacred geography. Stories of enlightenment, prophecy, and divine guidance were told and retold in marketplaces and monasteries, keeping spiritual imagination alive across time and space. Ultimately, the Silk Road was not only a path through deserts and mountains, but a spiritual highway that carried the dreams and convictions of countless generations. Buddhism brought serenity and philosophical depth to the East. Islam introduced a comprehensive spiritual framework that integrated every aspect of life, and Christianity offered its vision of redemption and divine love. Each faith carried a unique message, yet all found common ground in the hearts of those who listened. They left behind not only places of worship, but also ideas, stories, and artistic expressions that still echo in the cultures of Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. The spiritual legacy of the Silk Road reminds us that belief is as transportable as silk, as valuable as gold, and as enduring as the road itself. Through religion, the Silk Road was not just a path for trade, it became a journey of the soul. Samarkand and Bukhara, the glittering jewels of the Silk Road. Samarkand and Bukhara, names that shimmer with the legacy of centuries, stand as dazzling monuments to the cultural brilliance of the Silk Road. These ancient cities, nestled in the heart of Central Asia, were not just pit stops for weary travelers or bazaars for eager merchants. They were epicenters of learning, artistry, and civilization itself. To walk their streets in imagination is to tread upon the echo of empires, the soft footsteps of scholars, and the whispers of 1,000 languages exchanged under vaulted domes and turquoise minarets. Their grandeur wasn't merely in the goods that passed through them, but in the ideas, beliefs, and human aspirations that converged and bloomed there. The Silk Road did not simply ferry silk, spices, and porcelain. It carried the dreams of civilizations, and nowhere did these dreams shine more brightly than in Samarkand and Bukhara. Samarkand, often regarded as the Pearl of the East, captivated the hearts of those who saw its glistening tile work and majestic architecture rise from the arid landscape. With every conquest and dynasty, Samarkand absorbed and transformed the cultures that brushed against it. When Alexander the Great arrived, he marveled at the city's charm. When the Sogdians ruled, they made it a hub of vibrant commerce. And when Timur made it his capital, it bloomed into a marvel of urban planning and architectural innovation. Timur's vision was not just military conquest, but a legacy of knowledge and beauty that would awe generations. Under his patronage, artisans and architects from all over the world were summoned to create buildings that defied time. Structures like the Registan, which still stands in luminous glory, its mosaics sparkling like a night sky filled with stars. The city became a beacon of Islamic scholarship, scientific exploration, and philosophical inquiry. Madrasas, observatories, and libraries flourished, nurturing minds that would later influence distant lands. Meanwhile, Bukhara, its sister in splendor, quietly cultivated an aura of spiritual and scholarly authority. Known as the Dome of Islam in the Islamic world, Bukhara's mosques and madrasas were not merely religious institutions. They were crucibles of intellect. Here, sacred texts were not just recited, but dissected. Theological debates echoed through the halls, and new ideas took root in fertile soil. Its urban rhythm pulsed through caravanserais and open-air markets, where merchants haggled over carpets, gems, and spices, while poets scribbled verses in shaded courtyards. Bukhara's Kalyan minaret, rising like a flame toward the sky, served both as a call to prayer and a silent sentinel, witnessing centuries of transformation. From Zoroastrians to Muslims, from Persian influences to Turkic traditions, Bukhara's soul remained steadfast, a custodian of belief, culture, and identity. Unlike cities that vanished into oblivion after their prime, Bukhara endured, its essence preserved in the fabric of its streets and the cadence of its tales. What made these two cities more than mere trade outposts was the way they balanced commerce with culture. Traders did not just bring goods, they brought epics, rituals, and customs from lands as far apart as China and the Mediterranean. In the lively courtyards of Samarkand's bustling markets or Bukhara's shaded alleys, one could hear Chinese, Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic blending into a symphony of coexistence. The exchange went beyond silk and silver. It touched on astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and music. The scholars of Samarkand studied the heavens with instruments crafted with Persian precision and Indian insight, while the jurists and poets of Bukhara borrowed metaphors from distant lands and molded them into local beauty. It was in these exchanges that the Silk Road earned its true name, not for the fabric it moved, but for the threads of thought it wove together. Despite the geographical and political changes that swept across Central Asia, both Samarkand and Bukhara managed to retain their relevance. Even as empires fell and new powers emerged, they remained on the map not because of their strategic position alone, but because they had become repositories of memory and civilization. In times of turbulence, these cities became sanctuaries for scholars fleeing persecution, for books escaping the fires of intolerance, and for ideas that found fertile ground when denied elsewhere. Their endurance speaks of a deeper truth. Cities that anchor themselves in culture and learning build foundations that time cannot easily erase. While countless other way stations on the Silk Road turned to dust, Samarkand and Bukhara transformed into living museums, breathing reminders of what the ancient world could achieve when it valued beauty and wisdom alongside trade and power. Even their architecture tells stories beyond the material. In Samarkand, the Ulugh Beg Observatory still whispers secrets of the stars. Built by the astronomer king Ulugh Beg, it was a place where the heavens were charted not for fortune-telling, but for the sheer pursuit of knowledge. His star chart was so accurate that centuries later, scientists still marveled at its precision. This wasn't just a ruler indulging in vanity. It was a testament to an era that held learning in reverence. In Bukhara, the labyrinthine structure of the city mirrors the complexity of its intellectual traditions. The geometry of its madrasas, the symmetrical arches, and the rhythmic tile work are not only pleasing to the eye, but also reflect a profound sense of balance and harmony cherished in Islamic art and thought. The mystique of Samarkand and Bukhara also rests in their ability to inspire awe while remaining deeply human. Travelers who approach their gates after days across scorching deserts or snowy mountain passes often described an emotional transformation. The turquoise domes rising in the horizon didn't merely signal a city, they promised rest, safety, and wonder. Their fountains and gardens, nourished by ingenious irrigation systems, brought relief not just to the body, but to the soul. In the silence of a courtyard at dawn or the chants of evening prayer, visitors found not just a destination, but a sense of belonging to something greater, an ancient chain of connection that linked them to countless others across space and time. Even today, long after the decline of the traditional Silk Road, Samarkand and Bukhara continue to enchant those who seek them out. Though modernity hums through their streets, the past is never far behind. Locals still tell legends of wandering mystics and brave merchants. The bazaars may now sell souvenirs, but the voices of history echo in every arch and brick. Restoration efforts and UNESCO recognitions have ensured that the glory of these cities is not lost to the ravages of time. Yet their true preservation lies not in stone or tourist interest, but in the way they still invite the world to imagine, to listen, and to remember. It is perhaps this invitation, to remember and to dream, that makes Samarkand and Bukhara eternal. They remind us that civilization is not built merely on conquest or wealth, but on the slow, patient weaving of stories, symbols, and shared understanding. Their magic is not in frozen relics, but in living legacy. For every call to prayer that rises from a centuries-old minaret, for every shadow that dances across a blue-tiled wall, and for every breath of wind that carries the scent of old paper and silk through the marketplace, the spirit of the Silk Road lives on. And at its heart beat two radiant jewels, Samarkand and Bukhara, forever glittering, forever alive. In the soft twilight hours, when the sun casts golden hues across the domes and alleyways, Samarkand and Bukhara seem to dissolve the barrier between past and present. Each stone, each faded inscription feels like a whisper from a forgotten world that still breathes through the pulse of these enduring cities. Their charm lies not only in grandeur, but also in the intimate details. A weathered wooden door carved generations ago, a quiet courtyard where jasmine still blooms, or the faint smell of bread baking in a centuries-old oven. These subtle moments paint a richer picture than any monument alone could offer. Visitors often find themselves caught in a quiet reverie, their footsteps softened by the weight of history that wraps around every corner. Local artisans, descendants of master craftsmen, still shape clay, metal, and thread using age-old techniques, preserving not just an aesthetic but a way of being. These crafts are not mere commodities, they are conversations between the present and a legacy that refuses to fade. In this harmony of continuity and adaptation, Samarkand and Bukhara remind us that cultural brilliance does not disappear. It transforms, patiently waiting to be seen, felt, and carried forward once more. Byzantium and Silk, a tale of espionage and smuggled worms. In the grand tapestry of ancient trade and imperial ambition, few stories weave intrigue, innovation, and geopolitical chess as brilliantly as the saga of Byzantium and the silk trade. At the heart of this tale lies not only the shimmering allure of silk, but also a clandestine operation so daring, so critical, that it would alter the course of history. For centuries, silk remained one of the most coveted luxuries in the known world. Soft, luminous, and ethereal, it was more than just fabric. It was a symbol of imperial wealth and divine prestige. Yet its origin was a guarded secret of the Chinese empires, a monopoly so carefully preserved that revealing the secret of silk production was punishable by death. This is where Byzantium enters, not just as a consumer of this exotic fabric, but eventually as a daring player determined to unlock the mystery of its creation and challenge the Chinese stronghold. At the time, the Byzantine Empire was a formidable force straddling east and west. Its capital, Constantinople, gleamed with wealth and culture, acting as a beacon of Christian power and Roman continuity. But despite its sophistication, the empire remained at the mercy of foreign traders when it came to silk. The precious threads made their way westward through the labyrinthine routes of the Silk Road, often passing through the hands of Persian and Central Asian intermediaries, each of whom inflated the price and controlled the flow. Silk became more expensive than gold by weight in Constantinople, reserved for the robes of emperors, bishops, and the elite. For the Byzantines, gaining control over silk production was not just a matter of fashion or economy, it was a matter of sovereignty and security. The emperor at the center of this pivotal moment was Justinian I, a ruler as ambitious as he was devout. His reign saw sweeping reforms, monumental construction projects like the Hagia Sophia, and military campaigns to restore Rome's lost territories. But Justinian also understood the value of subtlety, and it was under his directive that one of the boldest acts of industrial espionage in history would unfold. Knowing that direct trade routes with China were blocked by the hostile Sasanian Empire and that silk remained a strategic commodity monopolized by the East, Justinian sought to circumvent these barriers through cunning rather than force. The opportunity came from a pair of unlikely agents, two monks, possibly of Nestorian or Eastern Christian background, who had traveled as missionaries deep into the heart of Asia. These monks, seasoned travelers fluent in multiple languages and familiar with the customs of both East and West, had witnessed firsthand the source of silk, the secret cultivation of silkworms. What had been shrouded in myth and speculation in the West, that silk came from trees or was harvested from sea creatures, was finally revealed. The monks understood the process involved not merely the worms, but the specific mulberry leaves they fed on, and the delicate art of harvesting the cocoons without damaging the threads. When these monks returned to the Byzantine Empire, they carried not only knowledge, but a proposition. In exchange for imperial support and favor, they offered to bring back the secret to Constantinople. Justinian agreed, and the mission was set in motion with utmost secrecy. Disguised and determined, the monks retraced their steps to the Far East. There, amidst danger and suspicion, they acquired silkworm eggs and concealed them within hollowed-out bamboo staffs, an ingenious method of smuggling that would go unnoticed even by the most scrupulous guards. Along with the eggs, they gathered mulberry seeds to ensure the worms would survive and thrive in foreign soil. Their journey back was perilous, winding through rugged terrain, unpredictable weather, and territories teeming with warlords and imperial patrols. Yet they succeeded, delivering their precious cargo to Justinian's court. For the first time, Byzantium had the means to produce silk independently. Imperial workshops were quickly established, and skilled artisans were trained under careful supervision. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. The empire no longer relied on the Persians or other intermediaries. Silk production within its borders allowed Byzantium to compete with Chinese and Persian textiles and export their own luxuriously dyed and patterned silks throughout Europe and beyond. This moment did not merely enrich the empire, it marked a dramatic shift in global economics. Byzantium became a key player in the luxury goods market, and its political leverage grew as a result. Silk garments, once rare and reserved for the most sacred rituals, began to appear more widely among the aristocracy and church elites, further cementing the divine aura of imperial authority. The empire could now clothe its envoys, generals, and clergy in the finest silk, projecting an image of opulence and power that rivaled even Rome at its height. However, the smuggling of silkworms was not without consequence. It sowed the seeds of rivalry with Persia, who saw the Byzantine silk workshops as a direct challenge to their role as middlemen in the silk trade. Tensions flared, and conflicts intensified along border regions, particularly in Armenia and the Caucasus, where control of trade routes was fiercely contested. Moreover, China's awareness of silk production spreading westward may have influenced its later efforts to secure and guard trade corridors with increased vigilance. Despite this, Byzantium held onto its silk monopoly in Europe for several centuries. The production was kept under tight state control, with laws governing who could wear silk and what colors were reserved for imperial use. Purple silk, in particular, became the exclusive domain of the emperor, a symbol so powerful that it gave rise to the phrase, "born in the purple," indicating royal lineage. The imperial factories of Constantinople produced textiles that were not only luxurious, but also imbued with political meaning, depicting Christian iconography, imperial regalia, and symbols of divine authority. The tale of Byzantium and silk is more than a story of trade. It is a testament to the power of knowledge and the daring to acquire it. In a world where secrets were guarded more fiercely than treasure, the act of smuggling silkworms was nothing short of a revolution. It exemplifies how empires rise not only through conquest and diplomacy, but through calculated acts of innovation. The monks who risked their lives to bring silk production westward were not warriors, yet their actions reshaped the fabric, both literal and metaphorical, of a civilization. As centuries passed, other centers of silk production emerged. Eventually, sericulture spread into the Islamic world and Europe, diminishing Byzantium's monopoly. But the legacy of that first bold act lived on. It proved that information once liberated cannot be easily contained. The Byzantine Empire had managed, through patience, intelligence, and a touch of daring espionage, to alter the balance of global trade. Silk ceased to be a mystery and became a medium of imperial pride, a diplomatic tool, and a cultural treasure. The Byzantines not only wore silk, they mastered its symbolism. Whether in religious processions, imperial audiences, or diplomatic gifts, silk served as a visual reminder of the empire's reach and refinement. In the shadowed halls of Constantinople, where mosaics gleamed under candlelight and hymns echoed against marble domes, silk shimmered across vestments and banners, reflecting not just light, but centuries of ambition, secrecy, and global entanglement. In every thread of that silk was the whisper of a hidden journey, the hum of a monk's prayer, and the silent triumph of knowledge over distance. Marco Polo and the mythologizing of the Silk Road. Marco Polo's name resonates far beyond the boundaries of historical inquiry, echoing like a legend through time. His journey, chronicled in the Travels of Marco Polo, offered Europe a dramatic window into the East, weaving a narrative so rich, so fantastical that it blurred the lines between fact and fable. What Marco Polo achieved went beyond the act of travel. He became a symbol, a vessel through which the Silk Road itself was mythologized. In his account, deserts shimmered with mirages of unimaginable wealth, cities pulsed with the hum of multicultural splendor, and the court of the great Khan radiated an almost celestial authority. Whether every detail he recorded was entirely factual or not became secondary to the greater narrative force he wielded, the transformation of the Silk Road into a realm of wonder, ambition, and the unknowable. Born in 1254 in the Republic of Venice, Marco Polo came of age in a world already stirring with curiosity about lands beyond Europe. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo had ventured eastward before him, establishing contacts that would later shape Marco's destiny. In 1271, at the age of 17, Marco joined his father and uncle on a journey that would ultimately take them deep into the heart of the Mongol Empire. Reaching the court of Kublai Khan after years of travel, the Polos were not only welcomed but retained in service, with Marco eventually becoming an emissary of the Khan. This prolonged exposure to the diverse and expansive regions under Mongol control gave Marco a rare vantage point from which he could observe and later describe the breadth of Eurasia. Yet, what Marco Polo wrote, or more accurately, dictated during his imprisonment in Genoa in 1298, was not merely a factual log of his travels. It was a performance, a construction of narrative meant to captivate and impress. Europe, still emerging from a largely insular mindset, had little first-hand understanding of the vast Asian territories Marco described. So when he spoke of paper money, burning black stones, coal, vast cities like Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, or the use of salt as a means of currency, his words carried an aura of the surreal. For many of his contemporaries, these were not merely observations. They were revelations, almost bordering on sorcery. And therein lies the genesis of myth. Marco Polo, intentionally or not, became a conduit through which the East was filtered into European imagination. His descriptions of the Mongol court, with its lavish ceremonies, astronomical clocks, exotic animals, and military organization, painted a portrait of a world that was both intimidating and irresistible. The Silk Road, in his telling, was not just a trade network. It was a conduit of power, a theater of civilization in motion, connecting distant cultures through a shared rhythm of commerce and curiosity. His journey framed Asia not as a monolith, but as a continent alive with variants. Lands of snow and sand, of fierce warriors and peaceful scholars, of sacred rites and glittering markets. What made Marco Polo's account so potent was not just its content, but its timing. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its zenith, stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace enforced across vast regions by Mongol governance, meant that long-distance travel and trade were unusually safe. Merchants, scholars, and adventurers moved with relative freedom across regions that had once been perilously segmented. Polo's account served as both a record of this fleeting moment and a spark that ignited the European imagination. For generations, his stories served as proof that there existed a world of inexhaustible marvels beyond the Mediterranean horizon. It is important to note that much of what Polo described would not be verified until centuries later. Critics and skeptics in his own time, and even in modern scholarship, have pointed out inconsistencies, omissions, and exaggerations. He did not mention certain well-known features of Chinese society, such as the Great Wall, tea drinking, or the intricate nature of Chinese writing. Some have argued that he never reached China at all, and that his stories were amalgamations of hearsay and second-hand accounts. But the veracity of every detail in the travels of Marco Polo is less crucial than the role it played in shaping perceptions. His storytelling elevated the Silk Road from a series of dusty trade paths to a mythic artery pumping lifeblood between civilizations. Even the structure of his narrative contributed to this mythologizing effect. He described regions not merely as places on a map, but as living beings with personalities, rhythms, and secrets. A desert was not simply a stretch of sand, it was a haunted expanse where voices whispered from nowhere and mirages lured travelers to their doom. A city was not just a cluster of buildings, but a living jewel, glowing with gold-domed mosques, bustling bazaars, and palaces filled with silks that shimmered like moonlight. In Polo's rendering, every location had a soul, every journey a moral arc, every detail a symbolic weight. The influence of his tales extended far beyond the realm of historical geography. They seeped into art, literature, cartography, and later, colonial ambition. Medieval and Renaissance maps began to include regions based on his descriptions, often with wild embellishments. Dog-headed tribes, kingdoms ruled by priest-kings, rivers flowing with gems. Writers and poets mined his tales for metaphors of the exotic and the unattainable. Even explorers like Christopher Columbus were deeply inspired by Marco Polo's account, seeing in it a roadmap to unimaginable wealth and untapped realms. In this way, Polo's mythologizing of the Silk Road helped fuel the very engines of global exploration. Moreover, Marco Polo's journey symbolized a bridge, not only between East and West, but between the empirical and the mythical, the tangible and the aspirational. The Silk Road, as viewed through Polo's eyes, was not just about silks, spices, and trade goods. It was about the flow of ideas, the expansion of mental boundaries, and the embrace of awe. His storytelling elevated the act of travel to a form of cultural revelation. Through him, the East was not just a direction, it became a metaphor for what lay beyond the limits of understanding. One must also consider the conditions under which the stories were recorded. Imprisoned during a naval conflict between Venice and Genoa, Marco Polo dictated his tales to Rustichello da Pisa, a writer of romances. This collaboration may have added literary flair and structural drama to the account. Rustichello, already familiar with the tropes of courtly tales and chivalric adventures, may have encouraged embellishments or structured the narrative to fit popular narrative arcs. This fusion of reportage and romance made the travels of Marco Polo something greater than a mere travelogue. It became a work of proto-fiction, straddling the worlds of history and legend. As centuries passed, the figure of Marco Polo evolved. To some, he became the archetype of the brave European traveler who dared to venture into the unknown. To others, he symbolized the early messenger of globalization, carrying not just goods, but thoughts, dreams, and identities across borders. The Silk Road, thanks in part to Polo's storytelling, came to be viewed not merely as a trade network, but as a mythic path to enlightenment, danger, and transformation. Today, historians continue to debate aspects of Polo's account. Archaeological evidence, comparisons with Chinese sources, and critical textual analysis offer new insights and raise fresh questions. But regardless of how closely his tales align with material facts, their impact remains profound. They planted seeds in the Western imagination that would blossom into centuries of exploration, cultural inquiry, and fascination with the East. The Silk Road lives on in countless academic works, documentaries, films, and cultural initiatives, not only as a geographical reality, but as a symbol. And much of that symbolic power can be traced back to one Venetian merchant whose words blurred the line between the real and the wondrous. In mythologizing the Silk Road, Marco Polo did more than travel it. He turned it into a mirror through which his world could glimpse another. He infused trade routes with the gravity of legend, and in doing so, reshaped the narrative of East-West interaction for generations to come. Even if the man himself remains partly hidden behind the curtain of time, the myth he crafted continues to glow, like a caravan lamp dancing across desert sands. Women of the Silk Road, power, trade, and hidden influence. The Silk Road, an expansive network of trade routes that connected the East and West for centuries, was more than just a pathway for silk, spices, and precious goods. It was a vibrant corridor of cultural exchange, diplomacy, and human stories. Among the countless travelers and merchants who traversed these routes, women played significant but often overlooked roles. Their contributions were vital in shaping the economic, social, and political fabric of the regions linked by the Silk Road. Far from passive bystanders, these women wielded influence in various spheres: commerce, diplomacy, religion, and local governance, often navigating complex social structures to carve out spaces of power and agency. Women merchants and traders were integral to the flow of goods along the Silk Road. In cities such as Samarkand, Kashgar, and Dunhuang, women engaged in markets not only as consumers but also as sellers and negotiators. They handled commodities ranging from textiles to spices and were skilled in navigating the intricate systems of credit and barter that characterized Silk Road trade. The economic participation of women was not uniform across all cultures along the Silk Road, but in many communities, especially among the Sogdians and Uyghurs, women held considerable control over household finances and commercial enterprises. This economic involvement granted them a measure of independence and respect that extended beyond family boundaries. Marriage alliances along the Silk Road often served political and economic purposes, and women were central figures in these arrangements. Royal and noble families frequently married their daughters into powerful foreign houses to secure alliances, peace treaties, or trade agreements. Such marriages were strategic acts that went beyond mere family matters. They were essential tools of diplomacy and influence. Women in these roles acted as cultural intermediaries, transmitting customs, languages, and religious ideas across borders. Their unique position allowed them to shape perceptions and relations between distant powers, subtly influencing policy and fostering mutual understanding. In religious and spiritual contexts, women held key positions that shaped the cultural landscape of Silk Road societies. Buddhist nunneries, Christian convents, and Zoroastrian temples often counted women among their devotees and leaders. Female religious figures contributed to the spread of ideas and practices, helping to weave a spiritual tapestry that connected diverse peoples. In some cases, women patrons funded the construction of monasteries, temples, and religious art, demonstrating their ability to mobilize resources and assert cultural authority. These religious networks also provided women with education and social standing, creating alternative avenues for influence outside traditional patriarchal frameworks. Beyond commerce and religion, women in Silk Road societies played important roles in governance and local administration, particularly in frontier regions where central authority was weak or fragmented. Women from influential families occasionally assumed leadership roles, acting as regents, advisors, or community representatives. In nomadic societies, such as the Mongols and Turkic tribes, women were often involved in decision-making processes, including matters of war, peace, and resource distribution. Their leadership skills were recognized and valued, contributing to the stability and cohesion of tribal and urban communities alike. The cultural influence of women extended into art, literature, and daily customs. Silk Road cities were melting pots of languages, traditions, and aesthetics, and women were often custodians of these cultural exchanges. They transmitted storytelling, music, dance, and fashion, blending elements from various cultures into unique expressions. Women's roles as mothers and educators were crucial in this cultural synthesis, ensuring the survival and adaptation of diverse heritage in changing environments. Their artistic patronage also supported craftsmen and artisans, fostering vibrant creative communities that contributed to the Silk Road's rich cultural legacy. Despite their contributions, the histories of many Silk Road women have been obscured or marginalized in traditional narratives. Much of what is known comes from fragmentary records, traveler accounts, or archaeological discoveries that hint at their presence and agency. In recent decades, scholarship has increasingly sought to recover and highlight the stories of these women, revealing a complex picture of female power and influence across a vast and diverse region. Their experiences challenge simplistic views of Silk Road societies as exclusively male-dominated or static, emphasizing instead the dynamic interactions that shaped history. Women's influence on Silk Road trade was also reflected in their management of household economies and artisan production. Many families operated small workshops producing textiles, ceramics, or jewelry, often run or overseen by women. These domestic industries contributed to local economies and supplied goods for broader markets. The skills, knowledge, and networks cultivated in these contexts were passed down through generations, creating continuity and innovation in crafts. Women's labor thus bridged private and public spheres, integrating family life with larger economic systems. The transmission of knowledge and technology along the Silk Road was sometimes facilitated by women acting as couriers or cultural ambassadors. Their mobility, although constrained by social norms, allowed them to carry messages, ideas, and objects across regions. In some cases, women participated in caravan trade, traveling with merchants and assisting in logistical and social arrangements. Their roles required adaptability, diplomacy, and resilience, navigating diverse cultural expectations and physical challenges. Through these efforts, women helped sustain the intricate networks that kept the Silk Road alive. Political upheavals and shifting empires along the Silk Road frequently placed women in positions where they had to negotiate survival and influence. During periods of conquest or transition, women of noble or merchant families used their connections and acumen to protect their interests and communities. They engaged in negotiation, mediation, and alliance building, often operating behind the scenes but with tangible effects. Their ability to maneuver through turbulent political landscapes attests to a nuanced understanding of power that was both personal and collective. The Silk Road's religious plurality created spaces where women could assert spiritual authority and engage in interfaith dialogue. Buddhist texts mention prominent female practitioners who contributed to doctrinal developments or community leadership. Christian and Manichaean communities also included women who were active in religious education and missionary activities. These spiritual roles intersected with social status, enabling women to influence cultural and ethical norms. Their participation in religious life reflects the broader complexity of Silk Road societies, where diversity was both a challenge and a source of strength. Education among Silk Road women varied according to region and class, but was often more extensive than commonly assumed. Elite women frequently received instruction in languages, literature, religious doctrine, and practical skills necessary for managing estates and engaging in diplomacy. Such education empowered women to navigate multiple cultures and social settings, enhancing their ability to participate in political and economic affairs. Even women outside the elite sometimes gained literacy and specialized knowledge through religious institutions or family networks, contributing to a broader culture of learning. The intersection of gender, ethnicity, and social class created diverse experiences for women along the Silk Road. While some women enjoyed privileges and authority, others faced hardships associated with servitude, migration, or war. Yet, even in difficult circumstances, women found ways to exert agency, whether through community support, cultural expression, or economic activity. Their stories reflect resilience and adaptation in a region characterized by constant movement and change. Women's roles in Silk Road diplomacy were often informal but impactful. Through personal relationships, hospitality, and cultural exchange, women facilitated dialogue between different peoples. Their influence was sometimes visible in treaty negotiations, gift exchanges, and the maintenance of peace. Women's ability to bridge linguistic and cultural divides made them indispensable in fostering trust and cooperation. Such diplomatic activities underscore the importance of soft power alongside military or economic might in shaping Silk Road history. Artistic depictions from Silk Road sites occasionally portray women in positions of prominence, illustrating their social roles and symbolic significance. Murals, sculptures, and textiles reveal images of women participating in religious ceremonies, court life, or daily activities. These visual records complement textual sources, providing insights into gender dynamics and cultural values. The artistic representation of women also serves as a testament to their visibility and importance in Silk Road societies. The commercial success of certain Silk Road cities owed much to the entrepreneurial spirit of women who managed businesses, estates, or trade caravans. In some cases, women inherited property or commercial licenses, enabling them to operate independently. Their management skills and networks often spanned regional boundaries, contributing to economic integration. This economic agency challenged prevailing gender norms and highlighted the complexity of social organization in the Silk Road world. In summary, the women of the Silk Road were far from silent or invisible actors. Through commerce, diplomacy, religion, culture, and governance, they shaped the course of history along one of the most important trade routes in human civilization. Their stories reveal a tapestry of power and influence woven across diverse societies and epochs, demonstrating that the Silk Road's legacy is not only one of goods exchanged, but also of human agency, resilience, and connection. Recognizing and understanding the multifaceted roles of women enriches our appreciation of this remarkable historical phenomenon and honors the contributions of those whose voices were often muted in the grand narratives of the past. Silk Road fortresses, defense, tribute, and the price of passage. Along the vast, perilous stretches of the Silk Road, where merchants carried silk, spices, and secrets across mountains and deserts, there stood scattered beacons of power and control, fortresses that served as both guardians and gatekeepers. These strongholds were more than military structures. They were complex centers of governance, trade regulation, and cultural negotiation. Built at strategic choke points, perched atop cliffs or nestled near oases, the fortresses offered safety for some and exacted a price from others. For caravans weary from travel, these fortified sites could mean rest, protection, and access to local markets. But they also represented the cost of passage, as tolls, tributes, and enforced obedience were extracted from those who sought to cross borders or pass through contested regions. The Silk Road was not a unified empire, but a fragmented web of territories, and these fortresses symbolized the patchwork of authorities vying for influence along the route. Each fortress bore the fingerprint of the culture that built it. Chinese watchtowers of the Han Dynasty, with their towering walls and beacon systems, Persian citadels of baked mud brick protecting desert caravansaries, or Central Asian fortifications boasting intricate gates and observation towers. Their architectural differences reflected the diversity of the Silk Road, yet all served similar purposes: to monitor movement, tax commerce, and project the authority of the ruling power. The geography dictated where these fortresses emerged. Narrow mountain passes, river crossings, and desert edges were the preferred locations where it could be enforced, and escape was difficult. Fortresses stood as both deterrents to banditry and lures for plunder, as they often housed gold, tribute, and foreign goods waiting to be taxed or redistributed. The presence of a fortress along the Silk Road was a signal. It meant someone laid claim to the land and demanded acknowledgement. These were not just military installations, they were administrative outposts where scribes recorded goods, officials imposed tariffs, and soldiers upheld the law of distant rulers. Tribute collection was one of the most important functions. Merchants might be required to offer bolts of silk, sacks of pepper, or bars of precious metal in exchange for safe passage. Failure to comply could result in confiscation or imprisonment, and in some regions, tribute was not just a matter of taxation, but a ceremonial recognition of sovereignty. Some fortresses operated as toll stations, complete with ledgers and scribes, detailing the cargo of every caravan and the nationality of its traders. This complex bureaucracy, even in remote areas, reflects the deep entanglement between commerce and power. Yet these fortresses were not always agents of oppression. To many travelers, they offered a rare respite from the dangers of open terrain. Beyond their gates, merchants found walls strong enough to keep out raiders, wells filled with water, and lodgings to rest. In many cases, soldiers assigned to the fort would serve as escorts for parts of the journey, ensuring a degree of safety in exchange for continued tribute or alliance. The forts could also act as social spaces where traders met local populations, news was exchanged, and diplomatic relations were forged. The convergence of cultures at these military commercial nodes gave rise to hybrid customs and shared vocabularies. Languages blended, scripts were exchanged, and even architectural styles evolved in dialogue with one another. Control of fortresses often meant control of entire regions, and as such, they became central to the struggles of empires and local rulers alike. Conquering a major fortress could reroute trade, enrich new masters, and devastate rivals. The history of the Silk Road is marked by such contests, where dynasties rose and fell over these stone outposts. The Tang dynasty, for instance, maintained an elaborate system of garrisons to project power into Central Asia, sending troops to man remote fortresses and protect their economic interests. Similarly, the Persian Sassanids constructed imposing fortresses along their frontiers, not only to guard against Roman and later Arab incursions, but to tax and manage the trade that flowed from east to west. These powers understood that dominance of trade depended not only on goods and roads, but on force and control. Over time, the role of fortresses shifted in response to technological changes and geopolitical pressures. When new powers emerged, such as the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, they either absorbed existing fortresses or razed them to build anew, consolidating their control over trade through overwhelming force. Under Mongol rule, fortresses became more integrated into the state machinery as the empire emphasized relatively secure passage under the protection of a vast and fearsome military network. But even within this more unified system, tribute collection remained central. Fortresses continued to regulate movement, and taxes were still expected at every major checkpoint. Some fortified cities became miniature kingdoms in their own right, complete with their own courts, militias, and customs laws, only nominally tied to a distant imperial center. As caravan technology improved and trade routes shifted to accommodate changing political realities, some fortresses declined into ruins. Sand and time swallowed their walls. Others, however, continued to thrive as towns grew around them, turning into marketplaces and regional centers. Their origins as military posts gradually faded into legend, but their economic and administrative functions remained. In some cases, local rulers transformed them into palaces or religious complexes, layering new identities atop old walls. The adaptability of these structures speaks to their foundational role in the functioning of Silk Road commerce. Despite their strategic utility, fortresses were also points of vulnerability. Their presence invited attack and siege, especially during periods of instability. They were often the first targets in imperial campaigns and the last holdouts in rebellions. The cost of defending them was high, not just in materials and manpower, but in constant readiness. The men stationed at remote outposts lived lives of hardship, exposed to extreme weather, isolation, and occasional violence. For them, the flow of merchants was not just economic activity, but a reminder of their role in a vast, interconnected world that passed just beyond their gates. The psychological impact of these fortresses on travelers cannot be overstated. For a merchant trekking through desolate steppes or barren desert, the sight of high walls rising in the distance brought hope and caution in equal measure. It signaled survival, but also inspection. Every approach was watched, every wagon checked. The mood inside a fortress depended on the policies of its commander. Some were welcoming, others harsh. The politics of the local governor could make or break a journey, and savvy traders often brought gifts or letters of recommendation to smooth their passage. The diversity of peoples who passed through these fortresses made them melting pots of language, religion, and ideology. A fortress near a Buddhist monastery might see monks and pilgrims mingling with Muslim traders and Zoroastrian officials. Scripts from India, Persia, and China might be carved into the same stone walls. These intersections gave rise to a unique Silk Road culture, one that blended authority with tolerance, control with cosmopolitanism. The fortified walls contained not only soldiers and taxes, but ideas, carried by every new group that passed through and left traces behind. Even today, the crumbling remnants of these structures dot landscapes from China to Turkey, silent witnesses to centuries of negotiation, violence, diplomacy, and exchange. Archaeologists uncover their records, inscriptions, tax tablets, and fragments of foreign coinage, offering glimpses into the everyday management of global trade before modern borders. The echoes of shouted commands, the sound of camel hooves, and the clinking of coins still seem to linger in the dust. These fortresses remind us that the Silk Road was not just a path through geography, but a corridor governed by power and shaped by the constant negotiation between freedom and control. They tell a story of travel that was never truly free, of wealth that always had a price. Passage came at the cost of obedience, tribute, and surveillance. But it was this very tension between movement and restriction, between opportunity and oversight, that gave the Silk Road its enduring vitality. Fortresses were not obstacles, but frames that defined the rhythm of the journey, each marking the transition between zones of influence, languages, and laws. Their walls may have divided, but their gates enabled connection. The legacy today, Silk Road echoes in modern diplomacy and trade. The ancient Silk Road may have faded from the dusty landscapes of Central Asia and the rugged mountain passes of Persia and China, but its legacy continues to echo through the corridors of global diplomacy and international trade. In today's interconnected world, the spirit of the Silk Road lives on, not through camel caravans or parchment scrolls, but through complex trade agreements, infrastructure corridors, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic partnerships that stretch across continents. What once began as a network of routes connecting East and West has now transformed into a metaphorical blueprint for modern global collaboration, reflecting the enduring power of connectivity, exchange, and mutual dependency. Centuries ago, the Silk Road facilitated the flow of not only goods like silk, spices, ceramics, and glass, but also ideas, religions, languages, and technologies. Today, the symbolic weight of that route has been revived in various geopolitical initiatives aimed at fostering transnational cooperation. The most prominent example of this revival is the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, proposed by China in the 21st century. Although it differs in scale and mechanism from the ancient trade routes, the BRI reflects the same core principle, the belief that trade can be a vehicle for peace, influence, and prosperity. Through investments in ports, railways, and highways that stretch across Asia, Africa, and Europe, the initiative has opened up new trade corridors and reignited discussions around infrastructure-driven diplomacy. Modern trade routes that mirror the Silk Road's pathways are now reinforced with advanced technologies, efficient logistics, and international legal frameworks. High-speed railways replace camel caravans, and digital communication replaces handwritten missives. Yet, despite these technological evolutions, the underlying goals remain strikingly similar: to build bridges, literal and metaphorical, between cultures, economies, and nations. Nations today use these connections not only for economic purposes, but also as a means of soft power projection. The concept of economic diplomacy has gained traction, where governments seek influence and strategic alignment by offering trade incentives, infrastructure projects, and cultural exchanges. The revival of Silk Road ideals has also encouraged regional blocs to strengthen ties based on shared heritage and geography. Organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, promote cooperation among countries that were historically linked by the old trade routes. These alliances often emphasize connectivity, energy sharing, cultural understanding, and collective security, drawing a modern parallel to the interconnectedness once fostered by the Silk Road. In this way, the legacy of ancient trade continues to act as a powerful reminder of the benefits of unity amid diversity. In terms of economic policy, the echoes of the Silk Road are heard in the prioritization of free trade zones, customs union agreements, and multimodal transport corridors. Countries that lie along or near the old Silk Road routes have increasingly sought to transform their geographic locations into strategic assets. Kazakhstan, for instance, has branded itself as a vital hub in the Trans-Eurasian corridor, investing heavily in logistics and transportation infrastructure to facilitate east-west trade. Similarly, Turkey leverages its position as a bridge between Asia and Europe, reviving ancient trade routes with modern roads and ports that link the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and beyond. But beyond economics and infrastructure, the deeper legacy of the Silk Road rests in its ability to foster intercultural understanding. In a world often divided by politics, ideology, and competition for resources, the Silk Road stands as a historical example of coexistence and mutual enrichment. Modern cultural diplomacy programs, such as international student exchanges, art exhibitions, and interfaith dialogues, all harken back to the exchanges that once took place between Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian missionaries who shared more than just goods. They shared wisdom, stories, and philosophies. The legacy of such openness continues to influence global cooperation efforts today, especially in multi-ethnic societies and international forums focused on dialogue and peacebuilding. The United Nations and other international bodies frequently draw upon the imagery and philosophy of the Silk Road in campaigns for sustainable development and global partnership. In fact, UNESCO's Silk Roads program actively documents and promotes the shared heritage of the Silk Road regions, using it as a vehicle to foster intercultural dialogue and understanding. This recognition of the Silk Road not only as a historical reality, but also as a living concept helps bridge the past and present, reminding the global community that economic integration and cultural empathy are not modern inventions. They are ancient tools for human progress. In today's diplomatic circles, references to the Silk Road are often more than symbolic. They serve as a rhetorical tool to frame cooperation as mutually beneficial and historically rooted. Countries engaging in long-term trade deals or cultural exchanges often refer back to the principles of the Silk Road to promote trust, historical continuity, and a sense of shared destiny. This narrative is particularly potent in regions marked by past conflict or political tension, where invoking a shared history of cooperation can provide a foundation for renewed partnerships. The Silk Road's influence is also visible in the digital realm. With the rise of what some call the digital Silk Road, efforts are underway to link countries through fiber optic cables, e-commerce platforms, and cross-border data sharing initiatives. These projects aim to reduce the digital divide, encourage innovation, and ensure that even the most remote regions can participate in the global economy. Just as the physical Silk Road brought luxury goods and novel ideas to far-flung communities, today's digital corridors aim to bring information, opportunity, and education to places once considered isolated. Environmental diplomacy is another sphere where the Silk Road metaphor finds relevance. With transnational projects that span deserts, mountains, and rivers, sustainability has become a key concern. The legacy of the Silk Road reminds policymakers that long-term success depends not only on economic gain, but also on environmental stewardship. Countries involved in cross-border initiatives are increasingly required to balance development with conservation, ensuring that the new roads do not damage the cultural and ecological landscapes they traverse. Moreover, the Silk Road legacy plays a critical role in how nations perceive each other's strategic interests. It influences how alliances are formed, how trade routes are protected, and how economic zones are negotiated. The cooperative spirit that once allowed traders to cross from China to the Mediterranean under various empires and belief systems serves as a blueprint for today's globalized partnerships. The shared memory of peaceful interaction, even amidst difference, becomes a powerful counterbalance to the growing tide of nationalism and protectionism. Education and academic collaboration also reflect this legacy. Universities across continents now host Silk Road studies programs, encouraging interdisciplinary research on ancient trade, cultural diffusion, and geopolitical influence. These programs act as intellectual highways, linking scholars and students across borders, much like their merchant predecessors. They analyze the influence of the Silk Road not only in history, but also in contemporary issues such as migration, border dynamics, and international cooperation. The private sector, too, has embraced the Silk Road metaphor. Logistics companies, shipping conglomerates, and multinational corporations frame their branding and strategies around the idea of seamless global connection. Supply chain optimization tools are often marketed as the modern equivalent of navigating ancient trade routes, emphasizing flexibility, resilience, and global reach. The term Silk Road has become shorthand for enterprise that spans cultures, continents, and markets. In tourism, the Silk Road's legacy fuels curiosity and exploration. Governments and travel companies have revived interest in ancient caravan cities, offering travelers a chance to walk in the footsteps of traders and sages. From Uzbekistan's Samarkand and Bukhara to China's Dunhuang and Qian, these once forgotten towns are now symbols of historical wonder and modern revival. Tourism based on cultural heritage creates economic opportunities for local communities while reinforcing international goodwill and appreciation for shared human history. The continued resonance of the Silk Road is a testament to the human desire for connection, exchange, and progress. It underscores the idea that prosperity and peace are more likely achieved through engagement than isolation. As nations face new global challenges, from pandemics to climate change to economic inequality, the cooperative model embodied by the Silk Road offers valuable lessons. It encourages dialogue over division, partnership over rivalry, and vision over short-term gain. In the final analysis, the Silk Road is not merely a relic of the past, but a guiding thread for the future. Its legacy, woven through diplomacy, trade, culture, and technology, continues to shape the choices of nations and the fate of millions. While the modes of travel have changed and the goods exchanged have evolved, the core human desire to connect, collaborate, co-create remains as relevant as ever. The Silk Road lives on, not in the sands of the desert, but in the pacts we sign, the networks we build, and the bridges, both real and symbolic, we continue to cross.